Okay. Can you all see me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Your share?
Um,
No.
yeah.
Good. Thank you.
think I'm gonna sh Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, yeah, that should be good. Do you see it?
It's perfect.
Okay, good. Right. I mean, I'm assuming you want to say a few words with your own slides, so turn it off again.
So I guess we can start. Um, Dr. Wang, should I start and introduce the program and our speaker?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to the 2026 Broadening Carbon Summer School. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the U.S. National Science Foundation for its support through the AXANET Implementation Broadening Carbon Program, which has made the summer school and our growing international collaboration possible. In addition to the summer school, the AXANET grant also supports annual CMAMS conference, which we held in Gothenburg, Sweden this year, and we'll have the next one in Spain. So please stay tuned. This is the third summer school supported by the Broadening Carbon Ring project. This year themes is AI and machine learning for materials discovery, reflects one of the most exciting transformation in science and engineering today, where the artificial intelligence is accelerating discovery, design, optimization of advanced materials. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank all of our distinguished speakers for generously sharing their experience and making this virtual summer school possible. I want to also recognize the program PI, Dr. Chunlei Peggy Wang from University of Miami, and co-PIs, Dr. Mark Madu, formerly at UCR and currently at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, and Dr. Sam Keseng from San Diego State University, Dr. Rodrigo Martinez Duarte from Clemson University, and last but not least, Dr. Wang's PhD students, Owen and Matthew at the University of Miami for their help on the organization of this summer school. And thank you all for attending and making this possible. Just a simple housekeeping rule. So we will give our speakers for about 45 minutes for their presentations. And at the end, we will have a Q&A session. You can write your questions in the Q&A box. I can read them. And if you like to ask yourself, just raise your hand at the end of the presentation. I will unmute you and let you ask your questions. So once again, welcome you all and enjoy the summer school. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Markus Buehler from MIT. Dr. Buehler is the McAfee Professor of Engineering at MIT, a pioneer in AI-driven knowledge discovery and material science. He created graph-aware multi-agent AI platforms that run heterogeneous data into science-grounded, actionable insight, powering breakthroughs in material science, biology, and healthcare. Buehler is among the world's most cited material scientists and the recipient of numerous honors, including the Feynman Prize, ASME Ducker Medal, J.R. Rice Medal, and the Washington Award. He's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and a fellow of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. For more than a decade, he has also taught executive and technical professionals at MIT, shaping the next generation of leaders in engineering, knowledge discovery, and artificial intelligence. Today, he will be presenting AI agents to improve scientific inference. With that, the floor is yours, Dr. Buehler.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, happy to present here, and hopefully you'll find it interesting, and look forward to the Q&A we're going to have a little bit later today. Yeah. My talk's going to be really, at the heart of the AI revolution in science, and hopefully give you some things to think about and maybe utilize in your own research and your work. The key take-home message I'll be covering in the next 45 minutes or so is that AI for material science, mechanics, and obviously many other fields is moving from retrieving knowledge, sort of training a model based on what we already know, to conducting what we call autonomous discovery and knowledge creation. And that's the focus of my lab right now. And we have been able to publish some groundbreaking studies in this field, and hopefully, will stimulate your own applications. So our mission in my lab is, of course, sharing all these codes and methods open source, and hopefully you'll find it useful in adapting it to your own work. The bottom part of this of the slide shows a little bit on sort of the kind of aspiration that we have, and what I mean by that is on the left-hand side, you see sort of the paradigm of creating energy through methods like fire, like burning things. And of course, if you train a conventional retrieval-focused AI machine learning model, you're going to get back many different ways of making fire, but you're not necessarily going to sort of rewire the understanding of the world to create a fundamentally new technology or new science, and then from that technology, like fusion. Right? So this requires something more than just studying the world the way it is, but you have to be able to rethink the way the world might be. And this is the type of work, of course, that human scientists have been doing for many hundreds, thousands of years, actually. And currently we're at the cusp of teaching machines how to do that. And once we can automate the process of genuine discovery, new paradigms, new methods, fundamentally new ways to think about the world, we have achieved sort of a more general intelligence level that we, of course, all want to have. So this is recapping this a little bit, this point. I mean, we sort of have a fundamental distinction here between a sort of a paired, a kind of retrieval-focused memory AI that retrieves things that we already know. And, sort of on the other hand, of course, in science, we typically don't just want to retrieve things in literature unless you're writing a review article, right? Typically, when we're writing original research papers, we're challenging the status quo. We're inventing new ideas, proving them, showing how existing theories fail, building new materials that we didn't think were possible. And this all is really situated outside of the training distribution, that if you were to use a training corpus that exists basically, for example, on all the published papers in the world, you would have this enclosure here. Let me make sure you can see my, here we go. And the solutions that we're seeking, though, in science, of course, are outside of this distribution of data we already have. So this is fundamentally this dividing line between AI or machine learning techniques that are focusing on sort of helping scientists do things they already know, to actually being autonomous discovery agents. And this involves, a couple of really key ingredients. One of them is we have to have self-improving intelligence. The idea that you can train the model on all the things you already know, as it's probably clear from my introduction, isn't feasible. Right? But that's the whole point of discovery, is that you have to have the ability to change the view of the world. And so an AI system that does that has to be able to understand the limits of its own sort of predictive power, and it has to be able to change its own nature by collecting new data. So we typically divide it into three different categories in terms of how machine learning or data-driven methods have sort of evolved in science. The first one is the playback. And so the right-hand side shows an example like a music box. I mean, essentially it's treating existing data as a way for an approximation method. We might want to create an expert system or supervised models, regression models, and basically you're finding a way to reproducing existing data using some representation, some learned model. The second wave of sort of machine learning has become generative AI, which I would argue is the current paradigm widely used. So you have an AI that can generate new things from an existing distribution. Right? So you train the model on a set of data, like maybe the entire internet, the entire corpus of human knowledge, and you can retrieve from that distribution in any way you want, right? Including new combinations. So the equivalent in the music analogy would be a pianist that can play any kind of score, right? And the scores are already written. Now, the third part is really the interesting part, and that's the work we're mainly focused on these days, and that's discovery. So discovery, you are writing the score, the training data on the fly, because again, in discovery, the whole point of that is that you hopefully violate current beliefs and current understanding of how the world looks like. So you have to have an AI that can actually do that, and it's sort of closest to a jazz ensemble, self-organization. The score is written while it's being performed. And this is, I would argue, the current frontier where scientific discovery actually happens. And building these systems is what we currently are working on. So a couple of examples in sort of generally, I'll walk you through the different stages of these models and how they're built, and examples and how they apply. Okay, so the first few examples are just going to be an illustration of the kinds of things that are possible today. And then we'll go into a little more detail into how these systems are built. So one thing that we can already see is sort of as a scientist, I know many of you work on nanotechnology or maybe related fields. I mean, you'll have problems where maybe you want to design a new microstructure, right? So today we can already do this. So we can put in an example image. Maybe in this particular case, I try to create very creative solutions and materials. I'm using an image I took of a solar eclipse from a couple of years ago, and I'm combining this with design principles from diatoms that we find in natural materials. And from this, I'm creating a three-dimensional structure of a torus-like material, an architected material with certain properties. And so this is the kind of cross-domain thinking and integration that an AI can already do today. So now I'll show you a little bit more on the 3D modeling of the system later. Or we can do the same for sort of more traditional bio-inspired methods, like looking at leaf microstructures and asking the question, can I integrate design patterns from leaves, these leaf veneers, into with spider silk, spider web architectures, maybe with conch shells, and create new microstructures this way. And I can do this also for the nano level properties. Like on the right-hand side, you see a bunch of novel protein designs using inverse design methods. So if you give it a certain mechanical response or a certain dynamical response, like on the bottom, and the model will come up with a protein design that matches this particular target property, right? So these are all sort of examples, and I'll show you more details on how these things work. But it really becomes sort of multimodal reasoning. We have the ability to cross boundaries in how we build designs and how they relate to properties, and we can solve degenerate problems with this. There are many different solutions to a problem, and typically you iterate on these, and these generative methods are able to obviously give us solutions pretty quickly. We can also use AI to build 3D models and interactive physics-aware simulations. And so here's an example where we're using a model to give this image that we've generated of this 3D torus bio-inspired material. Again, this came from a solar eclipse image and a datum structure, and the model has come up with a 3D rendering. And now we're actually using the AI model to build us a 3D simulator of this. So this means that the model doesn't just ideate, it actually has a way of proving the physics. We can do this also for other systems like spider webs. Here's an example of a two-dimensional image of a spider web, and then the AI can build a 3D representation of the spider web, including a physics simulator and an export for a mesh, and we can print it. Right? So these are some things that open a lot of possibilities, right? Because it's no longer just image generation; it's actually generating a simulation. It's building a model that we can then use to export even into a 3D manufacturing system. And the same can be done, of course, for other systems like Fracture. Here's an example for Fracture. And yeah, I mean, we have a lot of different possibilities in converting sort of ideation into fully fledged physics simulations completely autonomously using these AI agents. Right? So this is something I think it opens a lot of possibilities. So how do these things work? And so this was just a little preview and some highlights of recent stuff I've done, but really, how do we really do this, and what are the sort of the steps involved in building these AI systems that can make discoveries, and what is discovery in the first place? So the previous examples didn't really show discoveries; they showed more of a conversion from an idea to a physics simulation, which is an example, actually, what I show here of models building models. And so in a sense, you're using an AI model to build a physics model. Right? And this can create a very powerful loop, right? Where you're creating an idea, you're building a physics simulation, or you're talking to a robot in a lab, you're building the materials in 3D printing, and you're going in an iteration loop. Okay. And all of this can be done autonomously. So a lot of this involves in my lab the integration of theory, computation, and experiment. Right? So you have of course, all these different scales involved, in materials, and I mean the nanoscale. You're working mainly at the sort of the lower end here, but yeah, a lot of times you're going to be interested in building something macro level for engineering. So how do we integrate these tools? And so historically, machine learning AI was used essentially to bridge the scales, and so we would build one of those blocks, right, to connect different scales. Maybe a surrogate model. And nowadays, I mean, we're really moving into these autonomous systems, which sort of replace the entire multi-scale framework with an AI system that can do all of these things autonomously and design new materials for impact resistance or other properties. And so this is my personal journey in this field. We started about 20 years ago, my lab at MIT, but of course before that, people were building these atom-by-atom simulations. My own work since 2000 and on, I mean, has focused really on building physics simulations of various kinds of materials, ceramics, metals, biological materials, proteins. We were the ones building the models for all these years. In about 2010, we became interested in meta discovery, meta learning. So we realized that by studying spider silk and metals and ceramics, we were in a unique position as theoreticians to actually connect the dots between very different systems. So we realized, I can actually learn something from spider silk and then apply this to ceramic design or nanomaterial design and so forth. But we were still doing this translation. We started working with category theory and graph theory to hopefully automate one day this transition, but it was really limited by humans to do this math. And then fast forward to 2025 or 2026, we actually are now in a position where models are really building other models. And these AI models are in fact executing not only the first principle simulations, but also the translation, the insight development across different disciplines. So this is becoming a reality. And this talk will kind of walk you through a couple of these ideas and methods and give you lots of references. Hopefully you can read up on it a little bit more. But one of the insights, of course, we've learned to appreciate is that in discovery and really, truly going outside of what we call the training distribution. Right? So you have to build a world model and you have to break it. And discovery, in fact, lives at the edge of what is known. Obviously, right? So previously, the boundary between the known world and the distribution beyond that, and that's really where the discovery happens, where we're crossing over. And it's an irreversible process, like fracture. So here's some work I've done many years ago, actually about 20 years ago, on dynamic fracture. And like in fracture, discovery is a distributive process, right? So you create a material, you stress the theory, and then you break the theory, right? And you build a new theory. And this new theory is going to change the way you think about the world, right? Because it challenges the fundamental understanding of how you thought things worked, and now you're updating your beliefs, and the world actually looks quite different now. And this is written about, if you're interested in reading a little bit on this, in this article. It's called Why We Must Break the World. This blog article, basically on LinkedIn and X, but there's also a peer review article now that I wrote that is a little more extensive. You can find it on Chem Archive, and it's I think in press now at this journal if you want to take a look. So this talks a little bit about the philosophy of building these discovery systems using AI, the idea of breaking the world, meaning breaking the model of the world, and sort of giving examples from history of how human science has evolved and how we have accomplished sort of renewing our fundamental picture of how the world looks like. And that leads to scientific progress. So there are a few other things that are important. I mean, one of them is emergence. How do we build these systems? I mean, aspirationally, we want to build a system that can evolve, right? And one of the best examples actually are biological systems, ecosystems, or colonies of ants and bees, or even humans. These are all systems where the building block is a unit level of, let's say, intelligence or functionality. That doesn't actually change, but what changes is the organization of the building blocks. Okay, and so this happens, of course, in biological materials, in ecosystems, or even in human civilizations. I mean, we've been the same physiologically for about 100,000 years. And in this time, we haven't become smarter as individuals, but we have become better in interacting, I would argue, and storing information, sharing information, right? The printing press, new instruments, new tools to understand the world, new ways of educating each other, passing on information through generations, and so on. And so this really illustrates it's all about organization. Okay, and so there's many different knobs you can tune in intelligence. One of them is the way individual intelligent units interact. This is captured in what we call the society of mind theory, based on work by Minsky and others. And actually, early work in AI was trying to accomplish this, or trying to build these society of mind agents. And back then, these were becoming ultimately the expert systems, like mice and others, and they essentially failed because they were trying to mimic human behavior or human insights. Okay, and of course, that's dangerous thing to do. For one, you're not really giving the system ability to learn, right? You have to give a system ability to learn and scale with data and develop algorithms on its own. But more critically, I mean, these systems are very brittle. I mean, they only worked for the things we already had done. So they weren't able to actually deal with edge cases, and especially discovery obviously is an edge case by definition. We're at the edge of knowledge, right? So the fast forward, I mean, the ability to use neural networks and being able to have very flexible agents that can in fact actually self-organize became possible. And so fast forward 2024, we published one of our first multi-agent models, prod agents, which uses self-organized AI to discover proteins, including physics, including the ability to actually run simulations, is an illustration, I think, and I would argue, of some of those early ideas, but actually implemented in a working model. So how do these things work? So in our own work, we experimented with AI agents for a while, and again, inspired really by biology, because we knew in biology you have individual components that talk to each other. I mean, the hydrogen bond, or a species, an entity like an ant, and sort of emergence between complex entities, interfacial relationships, and how they come together to form something bigger than the sum of the parts is something I've been really interested in my work for a long time. So in 23, we actually experimented with this based on some of the early GPT models. And the idea was basically you take a GPT model, which had been shown to be able to write code. And we thought, what about letting the model not write code for a website, which is what the early demos did. The early GPT demos, remember in GPT 2 and 3, they created websites. I thought, why don't we make these models write input files for simulations and then organize the results of the simulations. And so the kind of the work I would do as a scientist, as a computational material scientist, I would be able to maybe offload this to a machine. And it worked actually quite well. So in this example, we built a multi-agent system, which is one of the first multi-agent systems ever built for surface science. Essentially took a query that we gave the model, and it, instead of memorizing the results, it actually produced a code to collect new data. So this was the ability to give agency to an AI to not only memorize stuff it has known, but actually let it collect new information. In this case, it ran a Python-based DFT code. It collected information about how the molecules' energies behave for different geometries, and then it fitted a regression curve to it, which you can see here. And that's what I ultimately received as a user of this model. And this is philosophically very different, right? Because it's not memorizing stuff. It's actually producing its own training data. It actually builds its own model, its own world model, and it ultimately gives you an answer for something that the model doesn't have to have seen before. Okay, and this really is in the vein of what we call reinforcement learning. So this is a shift, we argue, that moves away from supervised learning, where essentially you give a model known tasks and known answers, which is great for pre-training a model to give it some sort of general understanding of how things work. But in discovery, in out-of-distribution predictions, you can't use this. So we have to cross that out. And rather, we have to teach the model to understand how to get to the answer and actually discover its own solutions as it thinks through problems. And this can be done using reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning in this case is happening not only during the pre-training or post-training, but actually happening really during inference. Right? So during inference, the model will build a solution strategy. So this is actually shown on the right-hand side. So you kind of teach the model to not to memorize answers, because again, for discovery, we don't know the answer actually, right? So we teach the model, how do we build a strategy to get to the answer? And then we're penalizing the model if it gets the strategy right. In other words, if the answer works out, right, the model explains data or the model makes a new discovery. And if not, it has to go back to the drawing board and rewire this strategy. So this is a level of metacognition or meta reasoning, where reasoning over its own reasoning strategy. And so this is something you implement in a bunch of different models, including these Perflexo models, which are reinforcement-based learning models, or agentic systems, where we're sort of pushing this out into multiple agents. And so now the agents actually are able to sort of observe the world, learning about how the solution might be developed and make mistakes, right? So this is okay because the agent system has planners, critics, it has a manager, so it can actually learn from failures, and it doesn't have to know the answer. And it can include physics, right? So one thing that we can do here, which is really exciting, I think, as I spent most of my career building these multi-scale first principles models, it can actually include agents that can run physics of systems that it has designed, or asking questions about certain hypotheses, certain scenarios, and it can run them. Okay, and you can do this at different scales. So we have published dozens of papers in the last few years on this. I mean, we can do this for atomistic simulations, DFT, as I showed earlier, continuum level. So this is this agentic system called Mac Agents that deals with continuum level simulations, right? Fluid mechanics, continuum mechanics, solid mechanics. And again, the model is able to actually not only it doesn't have to memorize the answer. It can actually develops a program. In the computer science language, programming means you're writing a code, right? And instead of solving the answer from memory, you're writing an executable program that you can then run, right? For example, Python code, and you can critique that. So an agent can critique another agent can critique that for accuracy. It can read error messages. And this is really powerful. And these error messages or corrections are these reward signals that I talked about in the reinforcement learning framework I mentioned earlier. So this is it changes the paradigm from knowing the answer to learning the answer on the fly. Right? So doing inference, you're learning how to improve the predictions. And this works for many different systems. So there's papers, you can check it out on architected materials design. So in this case, we're building hierarchical structures and making them match certain type of mechanical responses. I already showed you earlier a little bit in the prod agent. So this was, one of the first models we published. It's a protein model, generative design model, but unlike conventional protein models that are essentially memorizing distributions, doing inference, doing generations, here we're using physics to validate the predictions. So those are not just imaginations or hallucinations of the model. These are actually predictions based on physics, physical principles. And so the model can learn from actual experimentation using simulations. This is a system where building atom-by-atom materials design for inorganic materials. We've done this also for alloys, right? So you can design new perovskites, for example, thermoelectric materials. So there's a wide range of applications actually here. And if you look at our Google Scholar or my lab's website, or you can find lots of different papers there if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this. Another really interesting thing is that in a lot of these AI techniques, you have to deal with existing literature. And even though existing literature doesn't necessarily give you the answer for the future, but it is something to base your predictions on. And one area we worked a lot on is structured knowledge representations. So there's original work, SciAgents, which is one of the first AI scientist agentic systems. Before we had Google's thing come out and others, we published SciAgents. It was originally in early 24. It's a system that reads literature, builds a world model, a knowledge presentation, and it abstracts principles and then predicts new outcomes, new hypotheses, and can, of course, be connected to also simulations, as I showed in the earlier examples. And based on this work, we've done different iterations of this model. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more on ontological models and graph representations, there's the SciAgents model, and then the graph agents, and then more recently we have this Mars system, which is a more complex multi-agent system for graph-based reasoning. The idea is essentially that if you organize your literature in a graph, you get a lot of really cool insights for free, if you wish, because graph representation of knowledge or anything really is a very efficient way of describing information. It's a small world representation. It means you can connect very distant ideas very efficiently using paths. So you can mine literature or corpus of literature and build a representation of that, and then you can understand the connections in a very efficient way. If you imagine reading thousands of papers or putting thousands of papers in the context of a large language model, it's highly inefficient, but building a graph representation allows you to externalize knowledge, so you can actually store information. You can falsify and verify relationships. So if you go back to this example here, you can actually use agents to validate or falsify things that you've discovered in the literature, or seek new relationships, new paths between ideas, right? So you can identify what are the different ways of how concepts are connected or related. And this can be done at scale. So you can do thousands, hundreds of thousands of papers and build very large graph representations of this. And you can mine this literature in interactive UIs. Also, we've published some work on this. This is a paper that's about to come out, building these UI interfaces where you can actually interact with these graph representations and really drive scientific discoveries through this process. And here's an example from the Mars system, which is a model that we developed most recently. So this is a system that has multiple agents that use these graph native reasoning methods, but validate them or falsify them. And in a particular application here is a material replacement problem. So this is funded by Saint-Gobain, which is a company in this particular case in the biological materials division, and they're interested in finding replacements for PFAS materials. And so this is a pretty hot topic right now. And what the system comes up with at the end is a replacement solution that sort of meets multiple target properties, right? So it can have the same functional requirements that the original material had, but builds it from different ingredients, different raw materials. And this is particularly here the constraint that this particular model doesn't design materials that are completely new. It actually uses existing materials and building it into a composite structure. And this is something that our sponsor here was really interested in because they're not interested in building a completely new material. They're interested in using existing materials from a catalog that they can order basically or use or manufacture. That's already tested, already FDA approved. And the question becomes more like building an integrated composite system. And so this is actually what this model could do. And in fact, could be validated against experimental studies as well. So these are examples of design. A lot of the work we're doing is in discovery. And so discovery is, of course, a whole new sort of avenue because in design, you know what you want. You know you want to get a certain type of material, you want to replace a certain material. In discovery, you don't know the answer. You don't even know the question. So it's like open-ended research, basic research. And the system that we've developed to that end is called Sparks. It's an end-to-end ideation and reasoning model that actually ultimately results in generalizable principles as an outcome. So what I mean by this is the model is trying to explore the world. It builds representations of the world. It collects new evidence, all this done through agents. So it's, again, collecting data as the model thinks through the problem. And it ultimately is incentivized to create reasonably simple representations. So it can't cheat and just build up a really complicated solution. And it has to organize. Okay, so maybe there isn't a unifying theory, but there are theories that explain different parts. And so we're giving the model incentives, of course, to create a unifying theory, but if not possible, to create multiple simple theories and understanding when these models apply. Right? So this is typically what science would be aiming to do, right? And so here we can do that actually. So here's a model that actually discovered scaling laws for proteins, and understanding sort of how certain features of protein sequences lead to larger level physical behaviors of proteins. And this is something we've then validated also through additional simulations from first principles level. So this is really, I think, one of the first principles-based reasoning systems to make discoveries, meaning fundamental principles rather than just predicting one solution or multiple, actually predicting a general insight, like a scaling law. And based on this, more recently, we've built a bunch of different architectures to really understand the science behind discovery much better. So this is a system we call Builder and Breaker. And there's a preprint on Chem Archive you can take a look at, and there's sort of bunch of papers actually that are coming out on this. But essentially, in this case, we're looking at building sort of the foundational theory behind discovery. How do we build the objective functions? What is the math needed to do this? And this particular paper, the Builder and Breaker, is really a general framework for discovery. So if you're interested in getting into AI for science and maybe building discovery systems, this is a great way to start. And this system actually applied this to different models and different scenarios. One of them was protein mechanics. And you can see that this model, again, like in the previous example of Sparks, it doesn't just discover sort of a complex neural network trained curve fitting, but actually discovers a principle. Right? So this model is incentivized to collect more and more data and explore the simplest possible representation to explain the vast amount of the biggest sort of diversity of data. And it goes through different iterations, hundreds of iterations to identify the right solution to the problem, completely autonomously. And so here you can see a little bit on how this works. So the model sees increasingly complex sets of data. So the builder agent, there are only two agents in this case. The builder agent builds the world model, and the breaker agent breaks it. Okay, and so there's an iteration. So and ultimately it comes up with a theory that's explainable. I think this is really attractive for a lot of engineering and science problems because we don't want a black box prediction. We want the model to actually understand scaling laws, analytical representations, the physics of the problem. So what actually predicts, in this case, the B factor of the protein? What is the sort of the genuine physics insight here? And if you read the paper, you can see that the model actually came up with some really neat idea that had not been explored by humans before. So this is entirely done autonomously. And what you see in a lot of these things is, of course, that sort of it's all happening at the interface. Right? So in the example of the agents, the builder and breaker agent, they are independent entities and they talk to each other, just like in this biological system. There's a retrieval of an existing corpus or existing data. There's a search and there's a discovery process. And discovery process meaning we're breaking the current understanding of how the world looks like. And in this process, the model goes through an extensive search and discovery algorithm. We're not telling the model what to look for or what to search. All we're telling the model is to build representations that explain a vast amount of data and to make it as simple as possible. And we built the model so that it can actually have some self-referential understanding. What I mean by this is the model has to be able to understand when its current representation of the world is insufficient. So it has some ability to understand where the boundaries are between the training data and what the prediction is currently making and where it fails. So this is arguably the most critical part, right, of these AI for science systems is that they're able to actually build new representations and understand when they are needed. And this is, I think, closest to a truly scalable AI system. So this, I think, agrees with a lot of the work by Richard Sutton, who was a pioneer in reinforcement learning, who sort of argues about the scaling, the importance of scaling an algorithm with data and compute. And these builder-breaker systems, these Spark-based systems are really able to do this autonomously. And they're going away, from the use of isolated tools, which is sort of the traditional way of doing things, right? You as a human orchestrate the model, the simulation, you orchestrate the LLM, if you're using LLMs for research. The experiment, we have the fixed agentic workflows, which we talked about so far, like a builder-breaker or Spark system, or maybe the Mars system or Psi agents. And these are all workflows where we have decided, here are the agents, this is how they can talk to each other. The next thing that we're working on right now is to build systems that are completely decentralized. So decentralized collectives, which means there's no preconceived notion even of what the agents are. There's not necessarily a prescription of what the agent's tools are even. We might give the agents access to the stuff we have done, maybe in our lab or as a society, as a civilization, but the model is able to decide on its own. So we're starting with the same agents, n copies. Maybe we start with 16 in the beginning, and these become swarms. Okay, and they differentiate. So different agents become different, have different traits. They share access to a world. We call it episodic memory, meaning they have access to experiments they've done before. They can talk to each other. They have mechanisms of doing this, and they can work on problems by getting feedback. Right? So the agents are updated based on their behaviors, based on the experience they get from running the experiment, trying to solve the problem, and they can of course birth new agents as well. So this works extremely well, actually. So if you build these very generic discovery systems, you can solve very different problems with the same architecture, like protein design and actually extracting design principles. Example here, structural proteins. You can discover vastly novel proteins, much more novel than any existing biological system could do. Also much more novel than a special purpose protein model would be able to generate, right? So if you think about protein diffusion models, which are state-of-the-art frontier models, they're always trained on existing data, whereas our agentic system, of course, isn't trained on data, right? So it starts with a generic AI agent, and it learns through experience. Now, of course, you have to pay for this with compute, right? So it's a lot more expensive, but the advantage is that this system can solve a protein design problem, which, by the way, we validated experimentally as well. So this is some experimental validation of designs. And you can also have these agents have physical agency, so they can talk to robots, right? So in a lot of these methods, of course, we want to connect to other labs. We want to connect to facilities like MIT Nano, simulations, and ultimately this led us into building a lot more general platforms. One of them is a platform we call Science Call Infinite, which is a method of integrating tools and agents from many different labs. Because you realize, of course, that building an agentic system based on your own research only is limited, right? Moving away from building the agents the way we think they should look like, we're sort of embracing the scaling of compute and data by letting agents evolve. But if you have agents that come from many different backgrounds, have maybe ability to come from different labs focusing on certain experimental facilities or manufacturing facilities. So this gives you a much broader platform. And so this system Infinite is actually, it's open source. It's named after the MIT Infinite Corridor, which is the sort of long corridor at MIT where people meet and exchange ideas. And so the Infinite system stores in a DAG, in a graph, essentially, all the experiments ever done. And so, unlike a paper where you're reporting maybe only the results that worked, here the agents report everything they've ever done. And it's accessible to any future agent, right? So this system is able to utilize and reutilize, recombine compositionally earlier experiments. So that's really the beauty of this. And we think this is the future of how science will look like, right? So the future of open source, open data or FAIR is not just sharing data, it's sharing the entire suite of how experiments were done, the results, the code, and making it machine readable, executable for agents. So it's not just humans reading it and curating it, but actually agents can automatically utilize these early results. That's pretty powerful. You can read about this paper. We put it in the archive a couple months ago, and there's totally open source implementation of this, both the Science Call agents and the Infinite system. And there's a lot of innovation in this development, which involves sort of figuring out how do agents communicate, giving them not telling them what to do and how to talk to each other, but giving them an infrastructure, an incentive. And one of the innovations is the artifact reactor, which gives agents a marketplace to negotiate essentially what is the biggest need, what is the biggest impact for a hypothesis that needs to be tested. What are the skills, the abilities that agents have? And there's a pressure there, right? So an agent can evolve itself to solve some of the problems, or an agent can already solve a problem, or an agent can pose a new problem that itself cannot accomplish by itself. And so there's this connection. And so this is exactly the idea. So you have these swarm algorithms, which where you take essentially copies of many different agents that interact, right? And they can essentially run science by itself. So this means that agents can propose, they verify, right? So this is the system, Science Call Infinite, where essentially they can have access to tools that could be specific to your lab. You can pose a problem. These agents are totally decentralized, so you can have agents that live in different computers, different systems, different continents, and they talk to each other completely autonomously. We can read it as well. They can solve real scientific problems. So for example, designing new materials. This is acoustic metamaterial. The agents have not only designed it, but also validated it. There's autonomous cross-domain research, protein design, and many other examples. And so this really is, we think, the future of how these agentic systems should look like, right? So they aren't just able to conduct sort of pre-programmed executions, but self-organize themselves. And you can trace, of course, all the things they do. So it's completely has high provenance. So you can see what they're doing. And yeah, here's the link on GitHub if you wanna check that out. So last thing I want to show you quickly before we do Q&A is sort of how agentic systems can be built differently. I mean, one of the things that you saw in all the previous examples is that we're essentially letting agents talk to each other in natural language, or whether it's code or algorithms or numbers or tokens. But essentially, we're decoding all the very rich latent information that's in the hidden state of a model. But what if we get rid of that? And actually, in this study, it's a program where we're removing the decoding. So instead of using the prediction of probabilities and then identifying one single token, which might be a number or a sequence fragment or whatever you're predicting or an image. We're actually letting the agents talk to each other directly in hidden states. So this is the internal latent representations the models have developed. And this means actually that the system becomes a lot more efficient. So agents, again, they don't talk to each other through tokens. They talk to each other through latent thoughts. This can be moving much more quickly. So there's still different agents. You can design, if you want, planning, critic, solver agents, and they go through this loop. Okay, but instead of, I'm gonna fast forward this a little bit. Instead of talking to each other in natural language, they ultimately only communicate in hidden states. Now, the final answer, as you saw in the movie, is given in natural language or in code or in equations here. But to get to that point, you never actually decode this rich information. And this means your agents need a lot less tokens, so they're much faster. The agents actually are more accurate as well. So the reasoning quality, the intellectual depth, and so on goes up generally, through different rounds of reasoning. And I think this is an exciting direction. So there's a lot more work coming on this from our group. There's also something I think is interesting is interpretability. So asking questions, this is some other emerging work we're engaging in right now, is what do these agents actually talk to each other about? Because we don't really see their thoughts anymore, right? Because we're not decoding it. Or if you look at a single, maybe a large language model, what is the model actually doing internally as it thinks through a problem, makes a prediction? So for example, you're giving a prompt. This is a prompt from science, and sort of, using interpretability techniques to look inside the model, what is it actually surfacing internally as thoughts? And it's quite interesting, right? So this question here talks about plastic elongation, and it actually, you can follow sort of internally how it reasons through the problem. So again, this is all the reasoning done in the different layers in this particular case of the model, not across different agents and not decoding it, but it's actually just looking inside. And so there's some really interesting insights here, how these models are actually reasoning in physical scientific principles and are actually creating their own internal abstractions. And once we understand how they do that, we can train them better. That's one application, of course, and we can also steer the thinking process and understand how they got to a solution. So there's really interesting work being done. The last thing I want to show is how do we actually execute all these agentic systems and all these, and what do you need infrastructure-wise? So, a few weeks ago, we had this amazing new Mythos or Fable model that was released by Anthropic, and then it was shut down because the government deemed it to be too dangerous. So one of the things that I think is very important for all of us, especially in the open source community, is to own the entire AI stack. And so to that effect, we've developed this Mistral AS program, which is an inference engine where you can serve a lot of these, especially science-focused AI tools, and allows you to serve local models pretty quickly. So this is a little movie that shows kind of how you do that. So you can very easily upload skills. So some of the examples I showed earlier of endowing these models with ability to do physics, you can upload skills to any open source model, just like you would to Anthropic or Fable. You can do this now, or OpenAI. You can do this with any open source model like Gamma 4. And here I'm uploading this fractal mechanics skill, which basically teaches the model how to run physics simulations. This is all the code you need, so very simple. And then once you've done this, you can ask questions, right? So for example, simulate a pre-cracked two-dimensional lattice, and you run it, right? And the model actually is able to execute a really complex physics simulation. So if you have existing workflows, you can teach the model very effectively. And all this is done entirely open source. So this is something I want to recommend for everyone, especially the students and postdocs, to look into, because it's important to own the entire stack, I think, and understand how to do this all entirely locally. So I ran all these examples, by the way, on my MacBook Pro or on a DGX Spark, which is a AI desktop supercomputer, which we have a bunch of those in our lab. So finally, where are we? I mean, I think we're very early in AI for science. A lot of times you think we're already sort of accomplished everything, but that's already not true. That's obviously not true. We are very early still, but we are kind of in the stage where we were in the 1980s with personal computers. So you remember at the time, For those of you who've been around in that time, I was too young to be really around, but I was sort of involved in the 1990s when I was a teenager. But yeah, at that time, we had personal computers, early Commodore or Intel based computers, Macs, things like this, early Apple computers, and they were basically terminal processors. They had lots of potential, and people were very excited about it, but they weren't quite useful. And it took another 20 years really to make these kind of computers useful as we are today. You know, you can order things, you can write books and papers on a computer. Back in those days, these were all aspirations. So we're kind of like a similar situation now. I think open source is very important, as I mentioned already. So all the stuff we do is all open source on our GitHub and Hugging Face pages. So GitHub is where we have our code. Typically in Hugging Face is where we have all of our data sets and all of our models. So check this out. You can find it on searching for it. And yeah, so the final thing I want to leave you with is really um, the transition right now that we're seeing is this fishing from known truths. In other words, using AI like ChatGPT is a way of retrieving a lot of the stuff that we've already done as humans. Great. It's a really cool way to interact with literature, with the caveat it might be made up. Okay. But most of the time it's pretty good, at least for sort of standard questions. But of course, the systems we're now building are these world building machines. So these are actually discovery machines that are able to not only uh, surface what we know, but create entirely new theories, entirely new materials, which shape the world. And yeah, that's sort of exciting moment right now we're in, and being able to see this and shape that and use this for the various kind of work we do as a group, as a community. Thank you very much, and yeah, I think we have time for some questions.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent talk and impressive achievements, of course. Any questions from our audience? I don't see any in the Q&A. So I have two questions. The first one is, based on all those achievements, where do you think we are now, or AI is now, compared to a PhD level scientist or seasoned researcher? And if we are not there yet, what does it take to get there, if we can ever? That's my question number one. Question number two, let me add that. So our community, our audience, mostly from material science, maybe a little bit of electrical engineers. So what would you advise our, especially young researchers, to get in this field? What kind of skills they need to acquire to work in? Do they need to focus on fundamentals of computing, I don't know, graph theory, or more coding? What would you recommend them?
Great, yeah. So the first question, yeah, of course, I answer both. Excellent questions. First one, it's really, there's a concept we call jagged intelligence, and that's something that people have coined a few years ago when some of the GPT models were really good at some certain aspects, and then they're really bad at others. And I think it's still true. So, there's a really, there's some coverage in areas that are extremely good, like in math. I mean, you've seen this, right? There are, even over the weekend again, there are really complex math problems, like the unit distance problem was solved by a GPT model recently, and more advances like this. So they're essentially not only like a grad student, they're actually better than the best mathematicians in the world right now, like at the very frontier. And they've admitted to that. I mean, I'm not making that up. I mean, you can read it, right? I mean, the Fields medalists have said, yes, these systems are at the very frontier of math that basically I couldn't figure it out. Humans couldn't figure it out 70 years long, and yes, the machine has been able to do it. So they're extremely strong in certain areas. In other areas, they're not as strong. I think physical AI is more challenging. Math and coding are problems that have sort of easy verifiers, right? So it's either true or not. You can write a proof, or write a Python code or a C++ code, and you can run it, and it will work or not, and it gives you an error message. In science, the thing I talked about here, I mean, a lot of these things are open-ended. They need proof. Proof is in the evidence and experimentation. So I'd say that, they're definitely good in certain areas like coding. They're far better than any humans. In math, probably better than humans. But yeah, building physical infrastructure. So coming back a little bit to the second question, I mean, building interfaces between AI and the physical world, I think is really, really a hot topic, because that's where the breakdown happens, right? You can't reason your way through everything. You have to, at some point, either run a first principle simulation, so having that skill, and being able to understand how do we run quantum simulations, how do we improve those algorithms is going to be really important. Quantum computers are very important because they give us feedback, these rewards I talked about. Or building physical infrastructure experimentation, connecting experimentation with like robots with these AI systems. So this is sort of some of the things. So that's where the breakdown happens. So a PhD student today that can go and run a simulation and then go into a lab in the afternoon and do a TM analysis. Clearly, a machine cannot yet do that, right? But if you're a theory student or maybe purely doing simulation, yeah, you have to. Your job is sort of already superseded by the capabilities of AI, so you become an orchestrator of these agents, right? So you're gonna have to learn how to use these techniques, and so there's sort of there's a gradient there, but I mean, I think generally the systems are becoming extremely good. I mean, in my own work, we've done, I mean, I showed in the beginning some of these examples of converting 2D images to 3D models. It's something my lab worked on for many years, collecting experimental data from spider webs, right, and very painfully creating MATLAB algorithms to convert them using all sorts of image processing techniques. I can single shot this now using any frontier model like Fable, Mythos, or GPT-5.6. They will essentially solve this problem in like 10 minutes of reasoning, and they do it really well. So these used to be PhDs that my students would work on. Again, the experimental data collection, I can't do this yet, but once you have the data, that work, it's trivial now. So the PhD will change, right? So this student who got the PhD a couple of years ago doing this, she probably would not have gotten a PhD, obviously, for this. She would have to work on something else. So the sort of level shifts a little bit, and I think as advisors, we have to understand this, and also teach our students, how to use the tools, how to use them responsibly, ethically, how to push the frontier in different ways. So yeah, the frontier, the level of research, I think, will change. It will increase in certain areas. So the second question, so how do you get into this? I mean, or how do you train? I mean, I think you definitely, as domain scientists, you have a really strong play you can make. As I mentioned, being able to understand how to do experiments, how to analyze them, how to run simulations, how to build these tools. A lot of the frontier AI labs are not familiar with the sort of specifics in these fields, nor do the models know how to do that because a lot of the literature is very sparse. I think physical AI, connecting the AI with physical infrastructure, that's a great area. So, don't give up this sort of skill and knowledge. But I mean, you have to sort of think about, are you becoming more of a method developing person, or are you building solutions to problems? Okay. And I think in my own journey as a scientist, I worked mainly on problems for most of my time. I mean, I worked mainly on solving actual physics problems or biology problems or mechanics problems, material science problems. But the last few years, we've become very interested in method development, partly because we saw the opportunity, right? So I think as a junior PhD student or junior faculty, you're going to have to probably make a decision. I think method development is risky because the impact depends on adaptation and stuff. You have to be early, right? You have to be successful in getting coverage. I would say, it depends on where you want to make the innovation happen. I mean, if you're building new methods, like you mentioned, graph theory, myself and my students, we work very heavily in foundations. I just came back from a computer science focused summit at Stanford. I'm actually here in Palo Alto right now. And they're all computer scientists. So I'm engaging a lot with that community right now where we're talking about fundamentally advancing these systems to build AGI. And that's just sort of how historically I've evolved into that kind of area because science is one of the frontiers in AGI, and so we become involved in this field. But and then of course, if you do this, you have to engage a lot more with the fundamentals and computer science and algorithms and the math behind this. But I would say there's a very big range of possibilities. I would say the most pragmatic thing is probably to take whatever you're passionate about and use these AI tools to accelerate what you can do. And these gives you superpowers, incredible superpowers. I mean, you can do things you couldn't even imagine you could do, right? If you have an idea, right, you can write a code, you can get a method developed. If you have hardware, probably you can have an AI agent help you connect your ideas to that hardware. So there's really incredible possibilities. You have to find your path. And the best thing is just experimentation. That's what I always say. But you can't really plan what's going to work, right? In science, or, you're gonna have to play around and find your passion, and you find where your skills and your questions you're asking match up with the biggest impact. And the only way to find out is by experimentation. So go give lots of talks and experiment, and yeah, put your codes on GitHub and Hugging Face and your models. That way the entire community can take advantage of it, and you'll appreciate actually, that the feedback you'll be getting and the things you can build in other people's work is incredible. So this is how computer science evolved so quickly. I mean, I learned from this a lot. In the more traditional materials community, you wouldn't share all these sort of raw materials historically, right? So the last few years we've seen increase in this, but in computer science it's always been like this. Everybody would publish their codes on GitHub, open source. Archive is always open source. As soon as you have a result, you put it there. So this is something that I'm hoping that all of us in the materials community and engineering and science will embrace more. And this will help us all to make much faster progress.
Well, thank you very much. Before we close, actually, I would like to ask again, I understand maybe all of the codes are available on your website, maybe, or open source, right? So our audience can reach out to that, or?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So you can take a look at LAM, MIT, both on Hugging Face and GitHub. And if most of the papers have references to that. If some things are missing, yeah, just reach out to me. Happy to talk. Right. Yeah. We put, all this stuff. That's again, like I said. So when we can make a lot faster progress, of course, by doing this. And the other thing that I would definitely encourage everyone is to read archive papers. That's how, there's two things. One is archive, of course, but the way I'm getting a lot of information about especially AI is on X. That's the place to understand and learn what is going on right now in the field. It's moving so quickly that if you read Nature papers, they're going to be 3 years behind or 2 years behind, or any kind of other journal, right? So they're great archival. We publish everything in archival journals, like traditionally done in our community, and that's very important. Peer review is important, of course, but to really see kind of like, you're asking, what's the frontier? What are the models? What are the great cool GitHub repositories I can build on? Go to X, make it a habit every day. You read in the morning the latest news on AI for science, follow good accounts and follow the discussion. It takes a little while to engage. So I spend lots of time every day reading exactly, following discussions on X, because I want to know what is going on. Every day there are new things. Some is noise, nonsense. You have to learn how to filter out the noise. And that's why it takes engagement, right? As a PI as well. So this is the other thing, right? So don't just tell your students or read things on X or read archive. You're going to have to be able to, follow and direct them and guide them. And we have a unique perspective as more senior scientists. We can understand bigger pictures. We understand the history. Like I can go back and understand the origin of size effects in metals, okay, or the discovery of nanotubes and all this stuff. And I know a little bit on how to weigh different advances and how important they really are. And so you combine this with guidance you can give to your students, and that's how we do a lot of work at sort of this frontier. But be very critical. There's lots of hype. Don't believe all the stuff that the big frontier labs are saying. Most of the stuff is, of course, correct, but there's, of course, a lot of marketing involved. So you have to always don't believe the benchmarks. Maybe I can say this to be diplomatic. Benchmarks are always maxed to give you the best performance on paper, but you, as a scientist, you have to try it for your problems. Keep your own private benchmark. Essentially, that's what I do. And then you really see how good these models actually are, or how good these techniques are. And it takes that kind of engagement.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent advice for your young audience as well. Well, thank you for your time. So let's thank our speaker and the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Buehler.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Dr. Wei Gao from Caltech. While he's setting up his screen, probably let me introduce him. Dr. Gao is a professor of medical engineering at the California Institute of Technology and investigator at the Heritage Medical Research Institute. He received his PhD in chemical engineering from University of California, San Diego in 2014, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley, before joining Caltech in 2017. His pioneering research bridges material science, nanotechnology, electronics, and biomedical engineering to develop next-generation wearable biosensors and flexible bioelectronic device devices capable of continuously monitoring biomarkers for personalized healthcare. These innovations are transforming precision medicine by enabling non-invasive, real-time health monitoring and intelligent therapeutic systems. Dr. Gao has received numerous prestigious awards, including the NSF Career Award, Sloan Research Fellowship, MIT Technology Review's Innovators Under 35, IEEE Technical Achievement Awards, and recognition as a calibrate highly cited researcher. Today, he will be talking about AI-reinforced wearable biosensors for personalized healthcare. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Gao, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. It's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to share our recent research on AI-reinforced wearable biosensors. I'm a professor, as mentioned, in medical engineering, and our department focuses on translational research. As we know that wearables can play a very important role in personalized healthcare because they can continuously collect a large set of data from our body. And this data can tell us what's going on and what's going wrong with our health. But if you look at all these commercially viable health monitors, like Apple Watch or Fitbit, so they can mainly track the physical activities of vital signs, but cannot provide more useful information about our health at a molecular level. So we think one major gap, which is also a great opportunity in the field of wearable sensors, how can we perform physiological monitoring at a molecular level? Ideally, non-invasively without accessing blood. We know that blood draw is not designed for continuous healthcare. And with this in mind, our lab proposed, we call it body interface biosensor. Especially, this can play a very important role in the era of digital health. If we could continuously monitor these biomarkers through this non-invasive biofluids, such as human sweat, interstitial fluid, only extruded cell breast condensate, or GI fluid, we can get these larger sets of data from our daily activities. And this can be used for health monitoring, for disease diagnosis, especially when we combine these larger sets of biochemical information with the physical information and AI. This will enable numerous fundamental and clinical investigations, especially to what we call AI-powered biomarker discovery. We also have multiple review articles published in the past few years. If you have interest, you are welcome to read this in more details. So we started actually our lab largely focused on human sweat analysis. And we are essentially sweating all the time. Sweat is an important fluid that we can retrieve continuously, conveniently, and non-invasively. And sweat contains many important analytes or biomarkers, including a number of different types of electrolytes, metabolites, nutrients. For example, we can find over 30 amino acids. There are over 300 proteins and different types of peptide hormones and substances such as heavy metals and drugs. And back to 10 years ago, while I was still a postdoc with Professor Ali Javi at UC Berkeley, so we presented a wearable sensor that can realize in situ monitoring of these different type of biomarkers, including metabolites such as glucose and lactate, electrolytes such as sodium and potassium, along with the skin temperature. So this is a wireless system allow us to conduct on-site signal conditioning, processing, and wireless transmission automatically. Eventually, all the data can be wirelessly sent to your phone through Bluetooth and displayed in the phone app, or you can save the data to the cloud. In this case, you can do different type of computing or data analysis later on for a variety of different applications. This work has been published 10 years, and it has been cited by over 5,000 times already as of this July. So at Caltech, over the past 9 years, I joined Caltech 2017. So over the past 9 years, we try to focus on address remaining challenges. How can we reliably collect data using our wearable sensor? And how useful is this data? Can we make the sensor more practical? Especially, as we mentioned, it's an AI-driven world. And the first part we try to address, the main challenge is how can we mass produce this sensor at larger scale and low cost? For chemical sensor, they are not like a physical sensor or pacemaker. Those ones can be used for years even. But chemical sensors, they don't last long. Like most successful continuous monitors, continuous glucose monitors, CGMs. They are quite helpful already, but you have to change the sensor every week or two. In this case, think about how can we make sensors more practical. Ideally, we should make sensor at larger scale, low cost. and make it disposable. So we propose multiple different approaches so that we can realize scalable manufacturing of these high-performance biosensors. The first way is laser engraving. So we can use CO2 laser to pattern this beautiful graphene structure on the surface of plastic substrates such as polyimide because of photothermal process. Essentially, laser is burning the surface of plastic, cause localized carbonization. So we can tune the laser parameters so that we can find the suitable graphene structure that can be show very high performance, much higher performance compared to other commercially available electrode material such as glass carbon, gold, or screen printed carbon as well. So if we tune laser parameter properly, we can also have a graphene structure that can be very suitable for biophysical sensing. And last but not least, we can use laser engraving to pattern microfluidics. So why we need a microfluidics? Because people always ask this question, when new sweat come out, what if it mixes with old sweat, right? Then we don't get real-time information. And sweat could evaporate as well. We want to make sure we get accurate real-time fresh sweat analysis. That's why by incorporating microfluidics, we can make sure when new sweat come out, it will push away old sweat in the microfluidics. So then in this case, the sensor will always analyze fresh sweat and with minimal influence from evaporation. So overall, physical sensor, chemical sensor, microfluidics can be entirely prepared using laser and plastics. You can imagine, it can be large scale and very low cost. We do a lot of printing as well. In this case, we can do inkjet printing, which is quite common used in a lot of lab or office setting. We know that we use color inks to print different documents. But in a laboratory setting, we can prepare our own inks. The inks made of different nanomaterials. This could be gold nanoparticle, silver nanoparticle, carbon nanodots, carbon nanotube, graphene oxide, silver nanowire, MOF, or encapsulation material. You just need to prepare these inks in the lab and print different patterns at different places so that you can have this high performance nanomaterial based physical chemical sensors. This can be used for human machine interaction as well as for multimodal wearable sensing. We can do 3D printing as well. So in this case, we can make our own 3D printing inks. For example, we can use this Maxine ink to prepare high performance temperature sensor, pressure sensor. So you can use this to look at body vital signs. We can print a microfluidic as well. In addition, we can print a biochemical sensor. Not only the working electrode, you can print using this 3D printing. You can also print functional material such as enzyme-trapped hydrogels. Last but not least, we can 3D print different type of energy storage device such as micro supercapacitors as well. So now with all these scalable manufactured multimodal sensor, we could collect data already, but we still face another major challenge. So how can we get a sweat? If we are doing sweat analysis, many people ask, what if I don't have a sweat, right? We know that if we do vigorous exercise, we could get a large amount of sweat. But again, for biomedical application or daily healthcare monitoring applications, most of the time we are not doing vigorous exercise. So we are facing this challenge. How can we get a sweat without need for any vigorous activities or strong heat exposure? So we learned from literature that there is a process called iontophoresis that can be used to locally induce sweat. It's actually, this is FDA-approved device. There are 2 electrodes applied on the skin, and if we apply a small current, the drugs in the hydrogel on the electrode will be transthermally delivered below the skin, and the drug will stimulate the sweat gland, trigger localized sweating. This is FDA-approved device used on the newborn infants, and the whole process is actually quite safe and biocompatible. That's why it's safe for infants already. But the problem, they are still very short-term. The current delivery is still milliampere level. You can feel it and bulky size. To address this problem, we propose a new wearable platform that integrates a miniaturized iontophoresis module. So in this case, this iontophoresis electrode is very small. We only need to apply a very tiny amount of current, only 50 to 100 microampere. You will not even feel anything. And we only apply for a few minutes, let's say 5 minutes. So this is sufficient for us to deliver a drug called a Capico that can induce sweat from hours to days. For myself, for example, if we put iontophoresis on my arm, my localized sweating will last for over 2 days, actually. In this case, by combining our microfluidic sensor, we can realize continuous monitoring. You see that now if we when sweat come out, we can put the microfluidics on the skin. So there's the black dye indicating the black dye indicating the oral sweat. And then first sweat will push away. First when we push away oral one, we get a new analysis in this case. So we can also not only we can induce sweat, we can continuously sample sweat for over a prolonged period of time. So in this case, by using bio-inspired microfluidics. So actually, we can design this super hydrophilic structure that can transport sweat from the skin to the microfluidics. And we also have this microstructured channel that can realize pump-free transport of sweat. Even when we sweat production is very low in a slow rate, we can still efficiently sample it over even multiple days through a single ionophoresis session. So with this, you can imagine now we can induce sweat locally. We can over the days continuously sample sweat with our sensor. Now allow us to collect continuous data. And this can be used for a lot of applications. I want to give you some application examples from simple diagnosis to point of care, and all the way through continuous monitoring coupled with AI-powered biomedical applications. Let's start with diagnosis. So cystic fibrosis is a genetic lung disease. So clinically, the gold standard for CF diagnosis is based on sweat chloride. So the doctor usually need to collect sweat and send out this sweat to a lab. This can be used for a laboratory test, which will usually take a week to know the result. And we worked with Stanford School of Medicine. We can apply our sensor on the healthy people and on the patients. So in this case, we can, within several minutes, 20 to 25 minutes, actually, a few minutes induce sweat, and 20 to 25 minutes, we can already read out sweat sodium and chloride level. So in this case, we test on healthy people and on the patients. Let me give you a second, please. So in this case, we show that in healthy people, the sodium and chloride level are lower than 20 millimolar, but for the patients, their levels are much higher, over 60 millimolar. We can say that our device can be used for screening and diagnosing cystic fibrosis. So of course, a diagnosis, we don't need all the time and continuously monitor system, right? That's why much of our effort is focusing on applying this for continuous sensing, especially towards monitoring different type of metabolic disorders. So, for example, one of the applications look at gout management. Gout is the inflammatory arthritis affecting tens of millions of people around the world already. So the key biomarker for gout is uric acid. And we develop a sensor that we can continuously monitor uric acid using our microfluidic sensor. So in this case, you see like from healthy people during a fasting stage, uric acid levels are low in both sweat and serum. After period-rich dietary intake, uric acid levels increased in both sweat and serum. And we recruited a patient with gout and subject with hyperuricemia as well, along with healthy people. This was in collaboration with the UCLA Medical Center, Dr. Chunlei, the chief of clinical nutrition at UCLA. And we observed that for patients with gout, their sweat uric acid level and serum uric acid levels are both much higher compared to healthy people. If we track one subject over 7-8 hours, we see sweat uric acid follow closely the blood ones. And the correlation what we get between sweat and serum is quite high already from the pilot studies, around 0.864. So this can be used indicating that we can use the sweat as a non-invasive source for gout management. We are running a clinical trial as well using the sensor to improve gout management. But of course, uric acid is very important for gout already, and also important for many other conditions. But what's important in our body is not only uric acid. Our body fluid contains many different types of circulating metabolites and nutrients, which all play a very important role in our body function. For example, we have 9 essential amino acids. Each one plays an important function. That's why they're called essential amino acid. We have many other metabolites and nutrients, such as lipid, such as vitamin as well. But many of these are not easy to monitor. So our solution is we propose to use this wearable sensor, integrates molecular imprinted polymer. Those are synthetic polymer. We can synthesize from solution phase together with target molecule. If we remove target molecule from the polymer, this molecular imprinted polymer will have cavities with the same shape and size as the target molecule again. So they can recognize target molecule again in this case. So this artificial polymer, they can recognize specific target. So by combining this on top of our laser integrated graphene, we can selectively monitor almost every single type of essential amino acid and many type of different type of vitamin as well. So actually, in this case, this allows us to continuously track our nutritional status. Can be very important for precision nutrition. Once we know more, we have a large set of data, and we know better about our nutritional status. This can be very important to enable precision nutrition. But actually, preparing this polymer on top of our graphene electrode require a lot of manual steps, optimization as well. So this makes the entire procedure may not be mass producible as well. To address this problem, we propose another solution. In this case, it's based on printable cold shell nanoparticle. This nanoparticle is a very unique structure. It has a redox protocol based on nickel HCF. This gives us measurable redox signal, electrochemical signals. And the outer shell is based on molecular imprinted polymer. They can selectively recognize the target. So now the single nanoparticle has built-in target recognition and signal transduction capabilities. We can synthesize this nanoparticle in bulk and make this into printable ink. In this case, through one-step inkjet printing, we can make these larger scale sensors already. We can make sensors that can be specific to different type of amino acid, vitamin, and even therapeutic drugs. I want to show you out of precision nutrition, we can apply this to look at therapeutic drug monitoring. And drug monitoring is very critical in precision medicine because every patient may react differently, even to the same amount of drug, right? So, but the drug level is critical for treatment. If you put a too high drug level to the patient, you may get a very strong side effect. And if you don't put enough drug, and patient will not get effective treatment, and they will develop drug resistance as well. That's why we want the drug to be in a certain range. We call this range a therapeutic window. But the problem is for many drugs, this therapeutic window is very narrow, very hard to control. That's why remote monitoring with continuous sensing capability is very critical to realize drug dose personalization. In this case, we can apply our molecular imprinted polymer-based wearable sensing technology to look at therapeutic drugs. We evaluated this for cyclophosphamide, bisulfan, and also mycophenolic acid, these three anti-cancer drugs. We test this in cancer patients at City of Hope National Medical Center. We show that what we see in human sweat, the drug level, show very similar pattern to blood, indicating that we can using wearable sensing as a non-invasive way, wearable sweat sensing as a non-invasive way to realize drug dose personalization. We also develop a sensor that can be used to track many important hormones, for example, stress hormone or female hormone. Now, women's health has attracted a lot of attention because it's substantially underdeveloped overall. And among the biomarkers for women's health, probably the most important one is female hormone, like estradiol, play a very critical role in all ages of women's health. In the fertility age, estradiol will tell us what time ovulation happens. And women also on average suffer 10 years from menopause, which, because their body cannot produce enough estradiol. That's why to address this problem, we developed nanomaterial-based biosensor that can quantify picomolar level estradiol non-invasively from sweat using this smart ring, actually. The sensing technology is based on aptamer. Aptamer is a synthetic nucleic acid strand selective to a target material, and we modify this on nanomaterial. And not go to detail here. The point is we are proposing a low background signal-on detection approach, allow us to quantify sub-picomolar level estradiol. And we made it into a wireless system. You see this small electronics, battery, and disposable sensor patch. And this allows us to track non-invasively estradiol level from women's daily activity. And we did a human study in over 2 menstrual cycles. You see that the sweat estradiol level also follow closely the serum one. And the correlation between sweat and serum is quite good as well. So indicating that, again, we can non-invasively track female hormone using wearable soil sensor. Out of female hormone, as I mentioned, stress hormone is very popular. Many people ask if we could track stress hormones. And we also presented this approach based on immunosensor, microfluidic wearable sensor. They can non-invasively track multiple stress hormones. Probably everyone knows cortisol. It's probably the most well-known stress hormone. It's very important for stress monitoring. Stress is so important to monitor because it's related to many different health conditions, but very difficult too because right now the gold standard is still based on questionnaire, which can be very subjective, right? So, but we also found that not only cortisol is critical for stress response, other stress hormone like adrenaline and noradrenaline is also critical because cortisol is reflective of systemic response, relatively slow, while adrenaline and noradrenaline, they are more reflective of fight or flight response, actually. They are rapid response. So we developed this sensor array. They can track multiple 3 stress hormones in this case continuously. An initial sensor, each sensor is not continuous actually. If we use antibody, each sensor can only work one time, but we can design the sensor array to have sweat feel the first sensing reservoir, get analyzed, and start to feel the second reservoir. So in this case, we get time sequential measurement of the multiplex stress response, stress hormone levels. And we found that stress hormone in sweat also show very good correlation with blood one as well. So this is the one way we can realize stress hormone dynamic response monitoring using this wearable sensor. And you may also argue, oh, even I know my stress hormone already, how do I know my stress level? This is where machine learning can play a very important role. As I mentioned earlier, in the very beginning of my introduction, having this continuous monitoring capability will give us opportunity to look at our body health status in a more comprehensive way. That's why if we combine biochemical sensing with biophysical sensing, having this multimodal data collection, we know better about our health. If you look at this, just want to give you one example here, stress response monitoring. If you look at stress monitoring, stress biomarkers, there are so many parameters can be called stress biomarkers. You know, commercial watches using PPG, pulse waveform, using heart rate, using skin conductance to look at stress response. There are a lot of biochemical response as biomarker as well, like cortisol. And many people not even know glucose itself is a very strong stress biomarker. If you wear CGM, you know that if you're under stress, your glucose level will quickly ramp up, just like your cortisol level. But none of this biomarker alone actually good enough to look at multiplex stress response. That's why our solutions have this multimodal sensor patch, realize multimodal data collection. So we designed this patch we call the CARES that integrates 9 different types of sensors, including 6 biochemical sensors and 3 biophysical sensor. Yeah. For the biophysical sensor, we included skin temperature monitoring, galvanic skin response, basically like a EDA, and also pulse waveform monitoring. Each one is very critical, also well known for stress response monitoring. And for the biochemical information, we integrated 6, including glucose, uric acid, lactate, and ions. We made the sensor to be very stable. And with our integrated wearable system, now during the day and night, you can continuously track this multimodal data. So through this multimodal data collection, as I mentioned, we know better about overall our physiological status and psychological status as well. And we did laboratory training, for example, ask our subject to control the stress test, put a hand into ice water, or play some VR game, or do vigorous exercise. Each one is a strong stressor. So when the subject gets stressed out, you see the biomarker level changes over time. And we recorded the relax during the test and recover period of time, having this multimodal data. And we also use the standard questionnaire to label the data. This is for the model training. For example, we use state anxiety. This is one of the well-known outcomes for stress response. Now with that, we can apply machine learning to analyze the data. And we show that we can clearly distinguish relaxed status and stress status by comparing different models. We show that this actually both show the best outcome to predict to classify different type of stressors. And the classification can be very high, in this case, over 98% based on the pilot study. Not only we want to distinguish different stressors, what's more important is can we get how much stress we have, stress level quantification, right? We also look at the correlation between each biomarker for stress response prediction. And based on the machine learning result, we show that by combining physical and chemical features, we can realize pretty high accuracy for predicting the stress response outcome, such as state anxiety level, for example. You see the accuracy can be up to, in this case, over 98% based on the pilot study. And we also show the feature importance among these physical and chemical biomarkers. Of course, this is a pilot study at early phase, but it shows that multimodal sensing can be very critical to realize a real-time stress response monitoring. And also, not only we are looking at monitoring, we can also using AI to look at possible interventions as well in the follow-up work. In another example, I want to show you, in the last example, I show you multimodal coupled with AI can enable new applications. This is just one example. We have a new upcoming work, not only for stress monitoring, for them, we can apply this to look at pain, to look at fatigue. Those are all very critical. The multimodal data coupled with AI. We also have an upper edge grant to look at multiple analyze for chronic pain in women. Our goal is also applying multimodal data, physical sensor, plus pain analyte monitoring along with machine learning to classify chronic pain in this case. Again, pain like stress, very hard to monitor, right? This is one major application of this AI-powered or AI-reinforced wearable sensing for healthcare monitoring. In another aspect, machine learning can play a very critical role as well. I want to show you one example, non-invasive continuous lipid profiling. So lipids play a very important role in our body function. I mean, like cholesterol, we know that. The triglycerol, these are very critical for our cardiometabolic disease monitoring. Those are key risk factors. If we could monitor these, this can be very important for metabolic disease management. But lipid, like cholesterol, triglycerides, those are lipids. Those are very hydrophobic. Those secretion of these biomarkers not as simple as other like hydrophilic markers. So their secretion can be strongly related to sweat rate and other factors, actually. So firstly, let's look at sensor, how to monitor lipids. In this case, we monitor 3 different important metabolites for this platform. For them, glucose sensor, we know that there's a glucose oxidase enzymatic reaction. We can realize continuous glucose monitoring. If we want to look at cholesterol, we are using a dual enzyme system, a cascade reaction, the dual enzyme reaction. In this case, through 2-step enzymatic reaction, we can get cholesterol measured. But for triglyceride, we need to have using 3 enzymes through this cascading reaction. Because 3 enzymes, each reactions require certain type of substrate and cofactors. So overall, we need to supply ATP to make this reaction happen. But in our body fluid, we have very limited ATP level. So our solutions, we design this nanomaterial, essentially polypyrrole nanowire. We can trap ATP inside the nanowire system. Then when sweat enters microfluidics, then this nanowire will slowly release ATP, providing ATP for this cascading reaction for TG diagnosis. Using this approach, we can realize continuous cholesterol and TG monitoring already. But even though we can monitor cholesterol and TG already through sweat analysis, what we see in sweat is quite different from what we see in blood. In previous slides, I showed you many sweat biomarkers show good correlation with blood already. But it's not true for cholesterol and TG because, as I mentioned, they are very hydrophobic. Their secretion is affected by sweat rate and other factors as well. That's why, in this case, machine learning can be very important to reveal the correlation or to establish the correlation between sweat and blood analyte. So our solution in this case, we are applying a causal machine learning model, actually. Not only we are directly predicting the blood, we are not trying to predict the blood lipid level using sweat one alone, actually. This direct correlation is quite weak, as you see that. Our data, because our data may not be, their size is not that big, that's why a simple classification will not work. So in this case, our causal framework really apply we also weighted the co-founding factors. Co-founding factors from the patient information, from sweat rate. So we can try to build a correlation between sweat and blood lipid levels. So eventually we are comparing, you see, sweat TG level, sweat cholesterol level, along with the sweat rate. Actually, we are considering the co-founders as well. For the CH co-founder, including the BMI, sex, fat percent, muscle mass, pulse, age, all these personal information we can collect from patient together with sweat rate and the sweat like a biomarker level. We can build the correlation. In this case, we can get a much higher correlation, as you see from here, from the R squared 0.02 to all the way through 0.8 already through this causal machine learning model. So this is another main application we show. Machine learning can play a very important role to build the correlation between sweat and blood, not only directly for the physiological status monitoring. So the last part of my talk, I want to briefly mention about our other efforts of this wearable sensing and how AI could play a very important role. Chronic wound monitoring is a very important aspect for healthcare. It has caused chronic wounds like a diabetes ulcer, venous wound, have caused huge financial burden in the U.S. healthcare system. That's why there is a strong demand to realize real-time sensing and possibly closed-loop treatment to enhance wound management. So in this case, we developed smart bandage. We can apply on the wound bed. We can multiplex monitor the wound biomarkers. Not only monitor wound biomarker, we can realize closed-loop treatment. In this case, this smart bandage patch, they simultaneously can monitor 6 different wound biomarkers. They can real-time deliver drug as well, for antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory drug delivery. They can also facilitate tissue regeneration through electrical stimulation. So not only that's the first generation smart bandage, we built the small form factor, we tested in a mice and rat model. And your new work, we try to integrate microfluidics as well so that we can real-time sample freshly secreted wound fluid. We develop sensors that can real-time analyze the reactive species. For example, reactive oxygen species or reactive nitrogen species, because those are biomarkers you have to do real time. If you post-analysis, the biomarker level is changed already in this case. So we have this using this again bioinspired microfluidics. So we can sample slowly secreted wound fluid. We can real time analyze this type of biomarkers already. But again, how useful is this data? Even you know wound biomarker level already or analyze level already, how useful is this data to a specific outcome, right? Then this, we need machine learning as well. And we show that through all the human trial in collaboration with the US medicine, we have applied this in different wound, and we real-time monitor wound healing as well. I want to show you 2 important outcomes. So like wound classification is very difficult to realize. There are different type of wound types actually. Classification usually require very experienced clinicians. And also wound healing prediction is also very difficult. Again, require very experienced clinician. But for many patients, they're living in a rural area or in the places very lack the centralized hospitals or well-established wound clinics. So they cannot have access to this expertise, and right, you need a very good clinician to evaluate this, and it's still very subjective. So our goal is, in this case, we can apply machine learning coupled with our sensor data so that we can predict different wound types or healing time. And we did that using, as you can see here, different machine learning combined with the real-time data we collected using smart bandage. This is another important example showing that it's AI coupled with this smart bandage can be used for different wound outcome prediction or management. So we also work on smart bandage. We try to extract data from Excel breasts. In this case, breasts contain very rich biomarker. There are a lot of groups work on electronic noses and try to develop gas sensors. They can respond to different type of wound, breast VOCs, for example, biomarkers. But gas sensor is very hard to reach high specificity for a single sensor. That's why people usually develop electronic nose gas sensor array using a large amount of array to do, and a larger set of data to train the model, and using machine learning to classify different type of health conditions from the responses of electronic noses. So our solution think about how to get a better selectivity for individual sensor. We know that electrochemical sensor have high performance for high specificity and selectivity. So in this case, we developed a smart mask. They can condensate exhale breath. We can harvest the main liquid part of the breath. So especially from the aerosol, the droplets of the exhale breath, we integrated the cooling modules. In this case, through hydrogel evaporation, we can cool down the breath. We also use the metamaterials that can enable radiative cooling. By combining hydrogel evaporative cooling and the metamaterial enable the radiative cooling, we can cool down breath quickly. And we have this microfluidics to sample the cooled harvested EBC sample, except breath condensate. A real-time sensor can continuously analyze the data. Now across activity, we can get a real-time multiplex data analysis, and we show that we can apply this to look at alcohol metabolism monitoring. We can apply this to monitor urea metabolism. We can use the EBC nitrate as indication for airway inflammation. And we even further validated this in patients with post-COVID, smokers, asthma, COPD, and again, even against clinical standard, phenol show very good accuracy. And we also recently get supported by Gates Foundation. We will deploy a new generation of smart mask to Africa for TB diagnosis. Last example I want to show you is not only we can collect data from out of the body, we can collect from inside the body as well. For example, we can build a smart pill. You can swallow this pill. The pill contains multiplex sensors as well. It can real-time track the mobility, track electrolyte level, metabolite level, and hormone level from the GI tract. And you can still wirelessly collect data, and you can apply, again, AI, machine learning for a variety of different applications. To summarize my talk, I showed you that wearable sensor is a very important topic that allow us to track, to monitor our health in our daily activity. Very importantly, we can collect large sets of biochemical information from our daily activity in this case. And these large sets of biochemical information are not previously accessible. If we couple this biochemical sensing data collection along with biophysical data collection, now we have multimodal data. And especially with the modern AI and machine learning algorithm development, we can work together. In this case, that can be used to enable numerous fundamental and clinical investigations, as I mentioned from the beginning. So in the end, I would like to thank my wonderful groups at Caltech that did most of the work, and our clinical collaborator for evaluating, validating technology, and our technology development collaborators to develop the overall integrated system. And finally, our funding support. Thank you very much for your attention. Happy to answer any question you might have.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gao. Certainly a lot of impressive achievements covering different aspects of personalized healthcare, impressive achievements. So the floor is open for the questions from our audience. Any question? You can raise your hand. I can unmute you if you like to, or you can type it in the Q&A chat box. So while waiting for the questions from our audience, I would like to ask a couple of questions. So obviously, a lot of more than at least one biomarker is required to diagnose a health condition, right? Mm-hmm. One is never enough to accurately diagnose, and more than one biomarker, and on top of that, maybe environmental factors, et cetera, et cetera. Exactly. And now we have the very nice, very capable platform foundational models that does something like that for natural languages or image processing, right? Would you imagine that something similar to that, or on top of those foundational models, a health model that would take into account all those aspects, maybe, tokenizing measurements of a sensor for a particular biomarker and also environmental conditions to assess, diagnose, sense a health condition, and maybe on top of that, recommending some mitigation or treatment plans, let's say. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think we can get there, or what would it take to get there?
Yeah, I think certainly that's actually a valid path. It's quite promising directions already. Even take advantage, think of the current CGM, right? Continuous glucose monitor. That's already a very successful example. At least for diabetes, we don't need a multiplex biomarker. Glucose may be already good enough, but still, from this like a measurement to the insulin delivery, a lot of algorithm get involved inside, right? But in reality, most of other health conditions, really, we need a lot of multiplex biomarker, and we don't know which ones are most important. Like a stress, as I mentioned, there are so many biomarkers getting involved. Now we can put many sensors together because we couldn't monitor this biomarker. Many sensors we cannot yet. That's why still a lot of technology development. But with the modern machine learning algorithm, we can now really get close to predicting this physiological status or condition. This is only step one. Like you mentioned, the closed loop, that's an important part. Actually, we are working on that as well. For example, if you look at stress level, anxiety level, not only we want to tell people you have high stress, we can modulate stress. In that case, large language model actually play a very important role. How to modulate that? You could talk with the people with like with the chatbot, with VR, with many different algorithms as well to close the loop. Of course, we can suggest medication as I should also therapeutic drug monitoring. So there are many possibilities. But right now, most critical part, we want to link the analyte we are measuring to specific health conditions. And many even Olympic teams play like a NBA or soccer teams. Many teams actually reach out as well. They want to use the stress level, for example, to optimize the performance. But first, you want to have a tool that can predict stress level very accurately. Then use this as a tool to realize closed loop, how to optimize performance, how to get better. Yeah, I think that's a very exciting way. Firstly, get accurate assessment. Then next one, closed loop. Each stage, AI can play a very important role. Yeah.
Thank you. So
Thanks.
I have another question from our audience. May I ask usually how to balance the AI response speed and sensor response speed? So I think there are different
Right.
speed.
That's very good question. Firstly, sensor response speed is a critical part. I'm a technology developer, so we are facing the challenge depending on biomarker. Some sensors, if you look at like EEG, EMG, or heart rate, they are more real time, a high frequency measurement you can take. But if you think about a lot of hormone, a lot of blood biomarker, they are relatively slow as well. There will be some delay as well. We have to consider from sensor recognition, there is delay from biomarker secretion to the sweat from blood. There is also delay as well. Those we need to adjust. That's why when we call real time, it's not really real time. It will be a little bit delay as well. Of course, the AI response speed, there's another factor, like a model, there will be delay when we do, in many cases, we need to collect data first and the model take computing and give a result. That's a good balance. And I think that's, firstly, through sensor response or AI computing, we can improve the response speed. The other way, for many of these biomedical use, we don't need that high temporal resolution to get more of a disease development is quite relatively chronic. As long as we see the trend of the changes, we give people early warning or sign. Most of these conditions quite good already. And of course, with the model development, if data get large enough, we will see things early as well. We can compensate this response delay using the AI algorithm from the like it's based database in this case. Yeah. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Another question from our audience. How can sweat be used as a biomarker for hormone monitoring as the hormones are primarily released into the bloodstream? What make it more reliable?
Yes. Hormones, let's say most hormones, a large number of hormones, they are relatively small molecules. For example, look at female hormone, look at stress hormone, their molecule weight is only a few hundred Daltons. So their secretion from blood to interstitial fluid and to sweat is surprisingly fast, actually. We only see a delay of only several minutes, let's say, from these hormones. And much of these hormones, if we do sweat analysis, they are better than blood one. For example, if you want to look at the stress hormone level, then you need to prick your finger to take blood. And this blood draw itself give people a lot of stress. We change a lot of things already. That's why non-invasive passive hormone monitoring is actually a preferred way in many cases, actually. Even for female hormone monitoring remotely at home, again, many people don't want to take blood draw. That's why non-invasive sensing is critical. And luckily, hormone are largely small molecules. And protein is the larger molecule, but it's relatively slow. The good side is the protein change in our body is not that fast either. That's why we can find a balance of time versus dilution, delay, and the required temporary solution. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Another question from our audience is that as AI becomes increasingly capable of designing sensors and interpreting biological data, where do you think the biggest bottleneck lies? Is it in data quality, physical models, autonomous experimentation, or developing new materials that can interact intelligently with biological systems?
Well, in this part, different people may have different opinion, but because I'm a sensor developer, I feel the biggest problem is data. We don't have high quality data. In clinical setting, people have a good amount of high quality data already, but only vital sign. Think about all the biochemical side. It's more like a blank already. We don't have data, even though we develop a lot of sensors, but they are not like the prototypes, the platform. They are not robust, reliable in most of the cases. How can we get comprehensive information about our body in multidimensional? Then AI, we feel like there are a lot of fancy, great models that have developed can be used for data analysis, but we don't get comprehensive information about our health. So I think to me, data quality in our field is most important. Can we monitor the biomarker that previous people cannot do it? And even we can do it, can we do it in real time and reliably? Can we trust the data over time? Yeah, that's an important part. Of course, other aspects can be important as well. Yeah, and people work on different fields, address different problems. And eventually we will all work together to have a good solution in precision healthcare. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And another question from audience is, how close are we to a wearable system that can autonomously sense, reason, and intervene in real time?
Yeah, as we said, a great example is already CGM, right? Like a company like Abbott, Medtronic, because they have this closed loop system already. That's involving continuous glucose monitoring. In the middle, there are a lot of AI algorithms getting involved, and eventually they will use the sensor data to direct deliver insulin. This is already insulin pump closed loop autonomous system. This is one successful example, all the FDA approved, used in diabetes management, which already changed the world in this case for diabetes management. This is just one example, and many other examples are on the way, I believe. So in our lab, we have several closed loop system demonstrated on the way to publish in the human subject as well. For example, a lot of physiological status you could do. And we also recently just demonstrate you can do physical, chemical sensing, and you can do nervous stimulation to realize closed loop as well. I think they are still on the way, but there are some already on the market, and there's a very promising direction down the road. I think a closed loop, AI-powered closed loop monitoring, sense and treat, right? Sense and act in general. That's a key direction.
Certainly, yes. So based on that, how far are we from getting a ChatGPT moment for smart, personalized healthcare devices? Or what are the challenges to get there? Something like ChatGPT that could answer all of our personalized health questions, how is my health? If I ask, okay, your cholesterol is that, and you have to take, or you have to walk more, or whatever, you have to sleep better, something like that. Personalized health, assistant, I would say.
Yeah, I think that will take a little bit more time, just simply because of availability of sensor. Because you think about that, 10 years ago, there is nothing even in the research field to can very little like amount data. 20 years ago, very few biochemical sensors you can collect. But just the past 10 years, the world has dramatically changed. There are a lot of new sensors get developed. So more and more, I would say, I can see the accelerated rate of more sensor. And people had the vision of the trillion sensor. Maybe we eventually can wear a lot of sensor, or with a smart algorithm, you don't need too many sensors, but in the process, right, we are trying to minimize sensor we are using, but we want to have a lot of sensor coupled with AI to reduce the final need. So I think, yeah, it's a hard question to see a specific timeline, but we are always getting better and better, right? The more and more demonstration of this AI-powered, AI-reinforced sensor for many applications. Eventually, we'll reach the AI will know more and more from sensor data that can be used for a lot of conditions. As simple as a Oura Ring, right? With AI, you can monitor stress, you can monitor sleep, you can monitor different activity already. Those are like AI plays such a critical role because the sensor is so simple inside the Oura Ring. They can do so many things already. I think, yeah, it's a combination of hardware development and AI model development. Yeah.
Okay, I think Dr. Wang raised her hand. So, Dr. Wang,
Peggy.
Peggy, can you go ahead and ask question? Dr. Wang. Dr. Wang, you can unmute yourself, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Wei Gao, for the nice talk.
Thank you.
I have one more question about for the students, for young researchers interested in combining all this material science, bioelectronics, AI together. Do you think which discipline will contribute the next major breakthrough? And what type of skills should they focus on developing?
Yeah, at least in my view, this right now is a modern world. Is a lot of biomedical problems require interdisciplinary expertise, right? So I think my suggestion is to have a broader view to look at real problem. This the challenge can be from material aspect, can be from hardware aspect, from system aspect as well. I think we should not limit ourselves to a specific domain if you think about solving a real problem. Now is the AR world, we can get a lot of information from all the different sources, and we may not have expertise on every of them, but we should have a vision for interdisciplinary research or collaboration. And eventually we can be good with only material or device, but we should think about at system level and work with the other team as well. So in this case, the work can be more impactful, right?
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I think that we don't have any more questions from our audience. So I think that concludes our talk or your talk. Thank you very much for your time. It was impressive to listen to you, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you very much. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Sergei Kalinin from UTK, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I'm having a little problem to make him a panelist. Just bear with me. I'll try my best to do that. Yes, I think he is here now as a panelist. Dr. Kalinin. I believe you can share your screen and unmute yourself now. While he's preparing for his talk, so let me introduce Dr. Kalinin. Dr. Sergei Kalinin is the Weston Fulton Professor of Materials Science and Engineering at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Dr. Kalinin earned his PhD in Materials Science and Engineering from University of Pennsylvania in 2002, following bachelor's and master's degree in Materials Science from Moscow State University. Before joining UTK, he spent nearly 2 decades at Oak Ridge National Lab, where he became one of the world's leading experts in scanning probe microscopy, electron microscopy, and nanoscale materials characterization. Between ORNL and UTK, Dr. Kalinin spent a year at Amazon Grand Challenge, the Moonshot Factory division of Amazon. His current research integrates artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomous experimentation, and advanced microscopy to enable atom-by-atom materials discovery and fabrication. Dr. Kalinin has authored more than 500 scientific publications, hold numerous patents, as he received many international honors, including the Feynman Prize in Nanotechnology and the BROADENING National Award for Young Scientists. Today, he will present Going Small and Fast to Go Big, Accelerating Material Discovery with Electron and Probe Microscopy of Combinatorial and Random Libraries. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Kalinin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to share some of the work that we have been working on at the University of Tennessee. So let me start with the general statement that material science is a very conservative science, so it generally cannot change overnight. So if you go to the material science lab now and the same lab, let's say 30 years ago, the type of tools that you will see would be absolutely the same. So the only difference is that 30 years ago we used the wooden boxes and now it's primarily plastic. But what happens now to material science comes to very close to the overnight change. So if you look at what happens in the industry world, so over the last 2 years, companies such as Lila Scientific or Periodic Labs have been somewhere around $500 million round A's. So the Prometheus project by Jeff Bezos got initial $6 billion investment, and now it goes to $40 billion valuation. And there are a lot of companies which are somewhat smaller, but still would be on the level of, let's say, $100 million. So for all of us who've been in the field, those very few of us who've been in the field of the machine learning for materials for quite some time, the general feeling is that this is us in a very small boat, and this is the huge community of the Google, Amazons, and general IT companies of the world that rapidly moving into the material space. So this is really very, very exciting time because this is a very high level of investment. But very important question is that whether we have reasons to be optimistic about this investment. So all of you heard about the AI winters, and all of you heard about the AI summers. So AI for materials is also not exactly a new concept. So for example, if you look at the literature around the late 90s, early 2000, there would be multiple symposia and let's say MRS conferences where with the titles that will sound very modern. So combinatorial and AI methods in material science. So this comes from the 2001. And if you look carefully at what people have been doing at that time, it would be, in terms of ideas, it would be very closely aligned with what is being done now. So there is this very famous statement by Santayana. So if you cannot remember the past, then you're going to repeat it. So it kind of makes sense to analyze what is the limiting, what are the bottlenecks. So can we really expect that the investment in the AI over the last 20 years will be translated into the real world impact? So for pretty much any material, there is a fairly long development pathway. So typically it takes about 20, 30 years from discovery to making the transition to the manufacturing. There are several important things about this process. So first of all, there is a lot of expectations that we will first theoretically predict materials and then we will experimentally verify it. This is actually not how material science works. In most cases, the materials are discovered serendipitously. And from this perspective, scaling theory by this point is already maybe not the right strategy, simply because, first of all, it's a question of the finite resources. But more importantly, if we scale theory, we can effectively discover only the materials for which we already know and understand physics. If the material has new physical mechanism behind the emergence of the properties, we would be limited in our capability to discover it. So second problem is that so we can scale theory. We actually can scale synthesis. Over the last 5 years, there was a tremendous investment in robotics and accelerated synthesis. However, the key bottleneck ultimately is characterization. So if we scale synthetic pathways by a factor of 1,000, so that's doable, but at the same time, X-ray measurement takes us half an hour now, and it took us half an hour 30 years ago, then the overall gain would be fairly limited. So basically, the idea is that if we really want to get advantage of material discovery, we also need to create the new tools that will allow us to characterize materials faster and close the loop from the synthesis to characterization to the update of the theoretical models. So this all being said, my own pathway to material discovery actually started from the point of view of characterization rather than theory or synthesis. So for almost 20 years now, I worked on the combination of the machine learning and microscopy. So one of the first short conferences papers where we argued that there is a merit combining machine learning and microscope was published more than 16 years ago. And we've done quite a lot of work on the using neural networks for analysis of the experimental data and so on and so forth. So generally, in terms of methods, everybody who entered the field tend to follow the same pathway, starting from the simple multivariate methods to neural networks. So we started to work with the deep learning around 2016. So for the last 10 years, I have been working primarily on the active learning methods when we have a machine learning agent and we deploy it on the operational instrument. So when I joined University of Tennessee, it actually had a fairly rich history of the automated experiment. So some of my colleagues worked on the combinatorial libraries for more than 15 years. My other colleagues worked on the, started one of the first labs in the country on the high throughput synthesis in 2019. So that was the time when this topic was very, very new. And now build it to the point of having the several synthetic robots and fully automated robots to synthesize the films in situ. And once I joined the UT, my effort was focused on building automated scanning probe microscopy, and I have collaborated with my colleagues in the electron microscopy field and the non-indentation to build the automated workflows for high throughput microscopy. So now I believe that University of Tennessee is probably the only place in the country that has a purely fully cloudified tools where we can send data to the supercomputer, analyze it, and return the control commands back to the instrument. But with all this being said, so imagine that you have the automated synthesis tools, you have the automated instruments. The question is, how can you really make all of this work together? So this is remarkably difficult, both in terms of the practical implementation and in terms of being able to kind of look through hype, because a lot of things that are being done now in the field of machine learning is very hype oriented, and the real value created by AI in the industry of manufacturing for the time being is very, very small. So one of the ways to sort of make navigation through the field of machine learning and experiment much easier is basically to consider two separate axes. So one axis of how we make decisions, another is how the decisions are executed. For example, decisions can be made by humans or AI. Decisions can be executed by humans' automated instruments, and basically all the combinations are possible. For example, if you ever look on the automated labs like Emerald Cloud, there the decision making is actually made by AI, but the execution is human. So it works like a giant fulfillment center. Obviously, ideally, we want to have AI controlling automated tools, but practically, humans are always a part of decision making, and a human, in most cases, would remain a part of the execution. This being said, once we have this type of framework, it becomes fairly easy to make it real. So we have to analyze how fast can decisions be made, how fast can decisions be executed, what decisions can be executed, how they can be improved, and so on and so forth. And the next interesting thing is basically trying to understand what type of decisions can be even automated by machine learning. So imagine that you run a lab that makes, let's say, hybrid perovskites using the solution synthesis. So you have a set of reagents. You can use the pipetting robot to make microcrystals and study optical properties. You can make thin films, and you can study them microstructure using CL measurements or XPS. You can make devices. So how can you make all of this work together? So it turns out that for some steps of these workflows, the machine learning methods work very well. For example, if I want to optimize materials within a certain library or use the measurements of the library in order to choose the promising composition for thin films, this is something that the machine learning can do remarkably well. But at the same time, if I want to use the result of cathodoluminescence in order to understand the phase emergence in the thin films, and based on that, optimize the synthesis, this is what the classical machine learning doesn't do very well at all. So the question is, what can we do? Generally, now we are considering two strategies for doing it. One strategy is top-down, using the agentic workflows. So basically, agents is, in some sense, is a custom-adapted ChatGPT. You can start with the large language model. You can fine-tune it for your own specific application. And it actually ends up being very exceptionally useful. So you can use it for literature mining. You can create the data sets. So the previous speaker mentioned that we need data. So it used to be the case that if you want to collect data out of, you can collect data out of the literature, you have to spend a lot of time and effort doing that. Now it turns out that the situation is far simpler. You can just use NotebookLM or make your own agents. Once you have this, it basically allows us to automate the whole pathway from literature mining, creating the representations of what has been done before, feeding it in the molecular discovery workflows. So something that used to be done by dedicated theory tool teams maybe as little as 3 years ago. So now this is something that the team of experimentalists can stand up. And it turns out that we can get a lot of mileage out of building the agents that are going to help us run the lab. So for example, create the agents, plan the experiment top-down using this agent approach, work with the synthesis and characterization tool, and then make decisions what to synthesize next. So this is an example of the agent running in the team of our collaborators that tries to reason of what type of molecules we have to synthesize, and in order to improve the perovskite material and why. So this is kind of few steps of this process. So, but the important thing is that this type of agents, remember that they're always trained on the past literature data. So they can reason using the same level of logic that was available in the publications that they were trained on. But if in many cases we have more complex tasks, for example, if we have a lot of experimental data, very often we want to analyze it. So it turns out that in this case, the large language model obviously cannot do it directly. So many of you heard about the difficulties in using ChatGPT to count the number of letters in the word strawberry. But what the large language model can do for you, it can write the small snippets of the Python code, which are task-oriented, but allow you to analyze the data very easily. And you can also provide the same type of approaches in order to analyze the data, learn how to deconvolute the experimental data in the phase composition, following certain prescription, and so on and so forth. Difficult thing is to combine the data from multiple measurements. For example, if one of your instrument gives the PL data set and another creates your structural data set, it is fairly difficult to discover the general principles based on which we have to compare these data sets. So it's possible, but this is an example of the heterogeneous decision making that humans do best, but the human interacting with the agent can do more effectively. And generally, the great thing now is that having the agentic workflows and standard optimization workflows, we can basically structure the exploration of complex composition spaces, optimize the synthesis routes, and so on and so forth. All this being said, agents and optimization are a great help in the chemistry lab, but and they allow us to use the lab robotics more efficiently. They allow us to plan experiment. So our baseline is human decision making. So agents on top of it allow us to do things either faster or based on the larger volume of information by informing or helping human to make decision. But there is another problem. And the second problem is that if we want to run the experiment faster, we are very much limited by the classical equipment stack. So machine learning can help us make better decisions and it can help us analyze the data, but it cannot magically make X-ray machine work much faster, because in this case, the limit is simply the number of the X-ray photons that are generated by the instrument. So, the strategy that my team is exploring is to go small and fast to go big. So the idea is that maybe rather than characterizing materials on the samples which are macroscopic, have multiple milligrams and sometimes gram of materials, we can study them on the nanometer scale. So obviously, not everything, not all properties can be measured in the nanometer region, but some can. For example, if I want to measure photovoltage, I can use the Kelvin probe microscopy rather than a classical photovoltage or photovoltaic measurements. If I want to measure the ferroelectric properties of material, I can use the scanning probe microscope that allows me to probe piezoelectric and ferroelectric properties essentially on the level of the tens of nanometers rather than classical ferroelectric tester. So this is exactly what we are doing. So this is the connection from the characterization tools to the material synthesis workflows, so we can screen materials faster. And after doing this type of work for 20 years, we started to formulate some interesting and maybe non-obvious conclusions about what type of machine learning we need. So for example, all of you heard that machine learning requires a lot of data. That's absolutely true. All of you heard that the hope or the aspiration, let's put it this way, of the big part of the machine learning community is to create the large foundational models that can make hypotheses about what experiments to do. However, if we move to the real world, situation changes a little bit. So for example, each hypothesis requires defining experimental footprint. The hypothesis that does not allow to formulate experiment to validate it such that this experiment can be executed on the instruments that we have is not particularly useful. So we always want to be able to, the important hypotheses from experimental perspective are the ones for which the experiment can be expressed in terms of operations that we have in our lab. So second consideration is that when we run the experiment, we of course want to collect as much data as possible. But if we plan the experiment, we want it to be as parsimonious as possible. So the goal of experiment is almost never to collect more data. The goal of experiment is to answer some specific scientific questions, so to falsify the hypothesis. And generally, we want to do it with as small amount of data as possible, simply because the data costs time and matter and money. So generally, when we talk about the past, we do want to have as much data as possible. But if we talk about planning for the future, we ultimately what we ultimately want to do is to make decisions and execute them as fast as possible. So we call this parameter an agency, so the capability to make and execute decisions compared to the human baseline. However, if we want to make and execute decisions, we need to first understand how humans do that. So imagine a very simple experiment. Imagine that I look at the screen of the microscope and I see this interesting microstructure, and the only operation that I can do is to choose the locations and run the hysteresis measurements that give me a curve like this. And what I want to learn is the relationship between the local microstructure and the shape of this hysteresis loop. So this is absolutely universal setting. You do this type of things in electron microscopy, scanning probe microscopy, nano-indentation. What's interesting, it is exactly the same type of problem as for molecular discovery. So instead of microstructure, you will have the molecular graph, and instead of hysteresis loop, you will have a property. So the type of exploration is almost the same. So the question is, how would human do that? So the obvious solution is, let's do the measurements everywhere. So this is what I've been doing in Oak Ridge for a long time. And over almost 10 years, we went from collecting about 10 to 100 megabyte data files to collecting up to 100 gigabyte data files. So as you can imagine, 10 years ago, that was a very non-trivial amount of data. And we were limited both by the damage to our probe and our analysis. So that was the motivation to move from getting more data to make better decisions about what data to take. But again, going back to these examples, how do we decide where to take the measurement? So in the beginning, so we kind of reverse engineer the human logic. So in the beginning, human will do the measurements here and here, where we don't expect anything interesting, but we need to calibrate our instrument. Then we can explore the properties here, here, and here in the regions that have these stripy structures. But if all these regions have the same properties, then we don't need to explore this one or this one or this one. We expect to have the same answer. Instead, we will do the measurement here when there is some unusual structure. But some of my colleagues can say that, look, rather than exploring this region because it looks unusual, you should explore it because there is a strain concentration here. So notice that action is the same, but the logic behind the action is different. And then the same colleague can tell me that next you should look at this region when this domain wall has a bend, and this is where we expect to have the interesting flex electric coupling. So why am I showing you this? Very simple reason. The operation that we run is absolutely the same, essentially point and click to collect the spectrum. But the logic of the decision making moves from optimizing the instrument to explore the statistically most represented regions, to exploring the anomalies, to falsifying the physical theory. So basically what it means is that the operation of the microscope can be represented as the workflow, as a sequence of commands that can be executed on the instrument sequentially. But what's very interesting is that we either need to define a policy, meaning this is what I see on the screen and this is what I do with that, or we need to define a reward. This is something that I want to discover, and in order to learn it, in order to do it, I need to learn the policy. So the reward can be myopic, available at each step, or reward can be sparse, available in the end of the experiment. But unless we have policy or rewards, we do not have automated experiment. So it would be the same thing as having the mathematical equation when we have a quality sign, but nothing on the right. And then you can ask a next question, whether this reward structures and policies are covered by classical machine learning or physics? And the answer is not. So imagine that I have this triangle where one corner is the data-driven methods, another corner is the physics methods, and then the third corner would be the reward. So reward can be very complicated, such as energy generation, storage materials. In these fields, the rewards would be very simple. For example, for data-driven methods, the simplest reward is minimization of the loss function. For physical models, the reward is the predictive power of the model, or if you follow Landau School of Physics, then parsimony of the structural representation. Obviously, practically, we have a spectrum of rewards from very simple to very complex. And interestingly enough, it's all a question of reading the right books in the right time. So if you look at the book by Peter Norvig, who is one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence, and sort of was one of the first 10 scientists hired by Google. So Norvig basically mentions that until now, all AI research assumed that performance measure is known as the form of the reward function. And the point that I'm trying to make is that for all of us, the difficulty in applying machine learning for the real world applications is not that we don't have enough data, and it's not that we don't have an algorithm. So in most cases, we have very sophisticated algorithms and kind of full toolbox of them. In many cases, we have more than enough data. What is the real problem is that we cannot define our reward function. And this is also well known in the machine learning community, except that it is known as an alignment problem. And if you remember discussions a few years ago that AI is going to kill us all, that's exactly the example of the alignment problem. The long-term objective may be not exactly aligned with the short-term rewards. So, the question that we asked ourselves was that maybe if we want to make machine learning useful for experimental sciences, we need to focus on the creation of the rewards. So what can the rewards be? So in microscopy, the obvious reward is the imaging optimization. So we always want our instruments to work better, and generally this is the internal reward function. Important reward function is the discovery of the physical laws. So a few years ago, we have demonstrated that we can build a machine learning agent that will run on the electron microscope, on the scanning probe microscope, and discover the laws of the ferroelectric domain growth autonomously. So you may ask, how comes we haven't heard about it? Isn't the development of the automated scientist one of the goals of the machine learning community? And the answer is absolutely yes. But remember the point that I made about that each hypothesis should have experimental footprint. So if you have just one microscope and one sample, then the number of hypotheses that can be verified in this case is very, very limited. So in most cases, if we make a physical hypothesis, we require multiple samples, multiple characterization modes, theory in the loop, and so on and so forth. So, but all of these things are very, very slow. So if we have fast feedback, then our experimental footprint becomes very, very narrow. So another example of the reward functions is the different image-based reward functions, structure property relationships, and so on and so forth. So let me show you a few examples so that these words like policy, reward, and so on are associated with something solid. So this is the example of the fixed policy experiment. Imagine that I scan this image, I separate it into small segments, and then I tell my microscope to do the measurements exactly at the ferroelectric domain walls. So this is very simple in terms of decision making. Just select 5 random points on the boundaries. It is fairly complex from the point of view of automation because the microscope does not have API, so we have to build it ourselves. But it's also very useful because in about 10 hours, we can run several thousand of this type of experiments. So imagine doing this type of things manually. So this is more complex example of the reward-driven experiment. So in this case, imagine that we can measure these hysteresis loops exactly as in the example that I have shown, but we want to discover the microstructure for which the hysteresis loop has the maximal area. So again, this is exactly the same type of problem as the structure-property relationship discovery for molecular system. So in this case, this is already an example of beyond human experiment because humans are not very good in building the complex correlative relationship between the microstructure and the local properties. But machine learning can do that. So this is the example of the active learning using the deep kernel learning algorithm, where our microscope have explored several locations, and then you see this color is basically measurement from 0 to 200. So you can see that our microscope have discovered the interesting locations. If we change our discovery parameter, then it will discover different locations. So depending on what physics we want to find, the instrument will learn. But the limitation here is our experimental footprint. So there are simply not that many hypotheses that we can validate with one instrument and one sample. So the question is, can we increase the experimental footprint somehow? And this is exactly the case where materials discovery comes into play, because now we can combine the power of microscopy to do quantitative measurements and the fairly established but somewhat not exactly forgotten but non-pursued for the last 20 years science of the combinatorial libraries. So combinatorial library by definition is built to essentially represent a cross-section of the phase diagram. So now our one sample has multiple composition chosen within certain synthesis space to one or two dimensional synthesis space. And this is how things work. So in this case, this is the full automated workflow. When we put the combinatorial library under the microscope will self-tune, so it will optimize the imaging, it will optimize the spectroscopy, and now you see how the instruments start to explore this combinatorial space of the library. It's actually pretty cool because if you come to the lab when the experiment runs, you start to see how the things magically get done by themselves. So notice that if we run this experiment, we automated the most important part, meaning the experiment, but it's still human who changes the sample because we have to do it every 10 hours or every day, every 24 hours. And building a robot that will do it for us is simply not justified in this case. Then you can ask a question whether this type of approach produces something useful. So let me give you another example of the ternary aluminum scandium boron nitride ferroelectric. So this is our combinatorial wafer. This is roughness. So roughness is the measure of the phase separation, and you can see the ferroelectric properties emerge exactly at this boundary. So at the same time, the hysteresis loop area shows a very different contrast, and here the minimal switching, work of switching is here. So if I want to build the ferroelectric memory device, I should start with the composition around this point. If I want to build a MEMS device, then I will build it here or here, depending on what I want to accomplish. And now we start to talk about the real acceleration of the research process. Because imagine that you learn how to run the experiment 3% faster. If you do this for a semiconductor fab lab or gigafactory for batteries, that's a really major impact. If you do it in the normal exploratory lab, nobody cares. Even if you do things 3 times faster, useful, but primarily makes your job easier, doesn't come with significant downstream impact. But if you learn how to do things 10 times faster, that's typically the disruption threshold. That means that you start to do things that could not have been done before. And in this case, our acceleration factor is about factor of 30. because if this type of measurements were done one sample, one characterization, it would take us a month. Now the whole cycle, synthesis and characterization, takes us a day. So we really start to get real acceleration of the experimental workflow. And very interesting opportunities start to be open if we combine different modalities. So we just started to do it because for the time being, we have to deal with the different tools and the different geographical sites within US. But this is same combinatorial library. If we explore it by the cathodoluminescence measurements, you can see that this part where there is no switching shows a high defect concentration. So we can speculate that the defects pin polarization switching, and at the same time, if we learn how to decode this CL data in terms of the defect population, we would be also able to uncover the defect equilibrium within the films. And interestingly, this approach is universal. For example, we can explore the magnetic phase diagrams in the same way. So obviously, we do it magnetic force microscopy because we have it, but there are better tools for doing it, such as single defect magnetometry. And this approach comes also with some fundamentally new opportunities for experiment planning. So if I want to learn how the film growth happens, we can grow a film which is grown like a wedge. And then if we explore this film, you can see how you will move from the step flow growth of the electrode to see how the Hafnia film actually grows on the material. So how the particles form, how particles nucleate, whether the roughness evolves. So one thing that we will immediately know that the particle size and particle count sort of saturate, which basically tells us what is the growth mode and allows us to develop the models of film evolution. There are other things that we learn. For example, for the optimized film, the roughness profile looks like this. And for the non-optimized film, we start to see very weird behaviors that are indicative of some stray reactions during the growth. So overall, it's a very powerful tool for exploring how the materials evolve, for evolution of the ferroelectric properties. So we can take the same combinatorial library. So this is the bias. This is the position along the library. You can see that ferroelectric properties manifest in one part and the non-equilibrium electrochemistry manifests in the other part. So very, very powerful tool. And as advertised, the same type of approach can also work for the photovoltaic measurements. So if we simply take a combinatorial library made out of the drop casting the hybrid perovskites, we can simply put the same library in the scanning probe microscope and take the measurement of the Kelvin probe signal with a light on and light off, and that gives us the photovoltage, which is the proxy for the photovoltaic properties. So we can explore the same type of automated experiment to rapidly explore this compositional space. So obviously, this is just the beginning of the story. So there are many directions in which this field can be taken. So one is adding the theory in the loop. That's super important because theory in the loop gives us the opportunity to run an experiment very much more efficiently. That's also super difficult because most of the time we cannot quite compare the experiment and the theory directly. So we need to run this type of experiments when the theory prediction and experiment predictions are comparable one-to-one. And then we need to choose what we do. Do we use theory as an oracle that allows us to make an experiment more effective? Or do we want to update or discover a theoretical model based on the experiment? So practically updating is complicated because usually our experiments are sampling low dimensional manifolds and are noisy. And if you do talk about DFT or MD type of theory, they are very kind of established models. But sometimes we can do that. So for example, thermodynamic models like CalFAD are almost ideal for theory in the loop, or the models like KMC can be incorporated as the part of the experimental loop. So this is the example of how we run the automated experiment under the microscope when our instrument measures the roughness of the sample, but at the same time, we run the KMC model and discover the KMC model parameter while running the active experimental campaign. So another very difficult thing is the transition from single experiment to multiple experiments when we have a single ML agent controlling different tools. So in this case, the difficulty is that we need to be able to compare the results apple to apples and be able to say how much one modality help us understand the other modality. So this has effectively have to be done through the joint reward function between the different characterization modalities. So anyway, this type of things work, but scanning probe microscopy is a great technique, but it's a limited technique. So we can measure topography, we can measure photovoltage, we can measure ferroelectric properties, we can measure magnetism, but everything else comes with a big question mark. And particularly, we don't have chemical sensitivity and we don't have structural sensitivity on the atomic level. But the good news is that electron microscope has all these characteristics. We can image material on the atomic level, we can get diffraction from the nanoscale volumes, we can map elemental composition, we can measure the band gaps. And if we look at the spectrum of the capabilities of modern electron microscopy, then within pretty good degree of approximation, we can say that it gives us on the nano and atomic scale very high quality proxies for macroscopic measurements. So we have electron crystallography can be done in a second compared to the X-ray crystallography. We have EELS, which gives us roughly the same information as Raman. We have EDX that gives us same information as chemical analysis, and so on and so forth. But therefore, you can ask a question that can we use electron microscope to accelerate materials discovery? So it can give us structure, it can give us properties. So what do we have to do to get it done, to use it? So notice that this logic is a little bit unusual because for those of you who are familiar with electron microscopy, this is typically a slow method. When you come to the lab, you spend a lot of time putting the sample in, then you spend hours tuning it, and only then you can get data. But unlike X-ray, where the limit is the physics of the instrument, in electron microscope, the limit is not the physics of the instrument. The limit is how fast the human can use the instrument. So the question is, can we really use machine learning in order to make things faster? And then the second question is, can we somehow squeeze multiple samples into electron microscope at the same time? And I pose that the answer for both questions is yes. It's not trivial because electron microscope generally has multiple cameras and detectors from multiple manufacturers. So if we want to automate it, we need to build the orchestrator that allows us to basically integrate APIs or clients for multiple detectors. But once we build the orchestrator, then we can control the electron microscope as a whole. So this is an example of how it works. So this is a video which is maybe about 2 years old, where we take the microscope, we take an image. This is gold in titanium particle. We stream the data to the University of Tennessee supercomputer. We analyze it using the classical simple foundational model. So in this case, it's SAM from Meta. And then we tell the microscope to find all the particles and take the EDX diffraction and EELS measurements at the centers of each particle, starting from large ones to the small ones. So notice that from the point of view of the decision making, this is a simple fixed policy experiment. We tell instrument in advance what we want to do, but it essentially demonstrates the capability. And if we can run this type of experiment, then we can run any type of experiment related to more advanced machine learning workflows. And also there is plenty of work on how we can automate the instrument in terms of self-focusing, self-tuning, and so on and so forth. It's not perfect yet, but our group, Berkeley, Cornell, have developed the workflows to do that. But then you can ask another question. So typically, putting sample in the electron microscope takes quite a lot of time. A lot of this time goes for the microscope to settle so that the sample does not drift. And if we can change a sample maybe 2-3 times a day, can we really run the experiment faster? So if machine learning allows us to run instrument 100 times faster, how do we avoid the situation when we become limited by the sample? And then the answer is that there are some interesting opportunities if we try to think in a little bit unusual direction. So this is the example coming from the non-indenter. So we build the non-indenter that is controlled by machine learning algorithm as well. And what we did in this case is that we created a sample where we have many different compositions of the material. So effectively, we took the dust from the floor of the machine workshop, and we put it in the epoxy, and then we have a lot of dust particles. But what we can do is to measure the chemical composition of each particle using EDX. So now we know the particle shape and location, and we also know the composition. And EDX is very large, fast measurement. If we created a sample like this and we put it into the non-indenter, we now can go from particle to particle. And once we do that, we basically explore the chemical space of the system. So practically, we in fact can squeeze 100 samples in one sample. From the point of view of the classical material science or chemistry, this is not a good thing to do because we have a mixture. But if we study the things locally, it's no longer a mixture. It's a collection of the objects that can be indexed based on the composition. And then the question is, if it works for non-indenter on the scale of tens and hundreds of microns, is there any reason why it should not work for electron microscopy? And the answer is it can. We can actually mix, in this case, 10 different nanoparticles, put it in the electron microscope, and you can see that we have multiple chemistries within the field of view. And then if we try it, so then the full workflow looks like this. So we need a region. We run the EDX measurements to index particles based on the composition. So we can use the shape in order to make this process more effective, because generally particles that have different composition also have different shapes, and not necessarily, but that's something we can verify. And then once we identify the chemistries, we can run structure property relationship, measure yields, and so on and so forth. It's fairly easy to build a simulator for this type of process, and it shows that we can definitely go to studying the hundreds of compositions per day, potentially thousands. And this is how it works if we realize it in the experiment. So this is the example of this random compositional library that we put inside of the instrument, and then the instrument starts to collect the information, start to explore it based on novelty, and collect structure property relationships. So basically, this is the whole idea of going small and fast to go big. So classically, we work with milligrams and centimeter type samples on the time scale of days. But if we learn how to prepare these nanoscale libraries, then we can expect that we would be able to use automated electron and probe microscopy in such a way as to characterize structure property relationship faster. And to do that, we need to have the tools that operate at the physical limit of the instrument rather than human. So now we are in a very interesting environment where classical paradigm for microscopy is the human sitting in front of the instrument, looking at the screen and turning the knobs. So for both for scanning probe and electron microscopy, this is about 100,000 instruments worldwide. There are probably several millions of human scientists that use them. So for last 3 years, we have been working on the instruments where there is a machine learning agent that controls the instrument. So, and then the human controls the behavior of the machine learning agent. So in this case, microscope can execute decisions 100 times faster than human can make them. So basically, on the human decision cycle, machine learning agents will execute hundreds of operations. But the reason why it is useful is because all our instruments for the time being are human operated. So we have a human decision-making baseline. And what's happening now is the transition from the simple optimization agents to much more complex agents where we use human and LLMs in order to dynamically control the dynamic decision-making by the agent. And that makes microscopes faster. And I also think that we are now starting to be in the realm of opportunity, because we now have a great potential to accelerate the materials discovery. So theory have been scaled for essentially 2 decades by now. Synthesis have been scaled for at least 5-6 years, so depending what country you're in. The bottleneck is the lab characterization. And there are 2 ways how we can break through this bottleneck. One is to take the intrinsically high throughput scattering tools like synchrotrons that can take structural data in seconds, but build the material synthesis factories as the end stations of the synchrotrons. And the other way is to take the geographically distributed electron and scanning probe microscopes and basically integrate them and build the sample preparation pipelines that allow us to multiply the sample and run these instruments and the limit of their technical capabilities. And the final point that I want to make is that there is a big difference between machine learning in a sense of the analysis of the acquired data and machine learning for building the autonomous tools. So for the former, we need data. For the latter, we need the agencies. So basically, our measure of performance is how many hypotheses can we test in the unit time rather than how much data we collect. So I'll be happy to stop here and answer the questions.
Well, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. So floor is open for questions. Any question from our audience? Okay, there's quite a long question. Since many crystalline materials can exist in multiple crystal structures and their electronic properties depend strongly on the crystal phase, how can computational predictions be validated if the synthesized sample contains mixed phases? Additionally, how can the desired crystal phase be isolated or identified so that the experimental results can be directly compared with the simulated model?
This is an excellent question, and that's exactly the reason why I tried making the point that we invested in some, until now, for the last 20 years, the investment into the theory and experiment was very unbalanced. So theory is absolutely important, but theory generally allows us to get some idea about the properties of the materials for which we know the mechanism behind the emergence of the properties. For example, if the DFT cannot predict the superconductors very well, we cannot expect to have efficient DFT screening pipelines for the superconductors. So same thing. Secondly, there are a lot of properties of materials that are controlled by defects. So it can start from something as simple as the ideal solid solutions all the way to very complex defects in the things like carbides, borides, and so on and so forth. And we simply don't expect theory to be able to predict the systems because the chemical universe of these defects is very large or can be very large and can be very degenerate in terms of energy. So the epistemic uncertainty of the theory and the fact that materials form usually in the non-equilibrium fashion simply does not allow us to predict what the defects will be. So therefore, what we try to propose is that rather than trying to scale the theory and then consider experiment as the validation, maybe we should invest effort into scaling the synthesis and then scaling the experiment characterization. So rather than predicting millions of materials, we actually learn how to synthesize and characterize millions of materials at the same time. And then all your questions are answered naturally because they can exist in the multiple crystal structures, but if we explore them on the nanoscale, each grain typically will be single crystalline. If it is polycrystalline, then we will see it because we generally get atomic resolution. And I mean, obviously, electronic properties that we can measure from yields are much more difficult to interpret than what we can extract from the DFT calculation. And we do need a theory to understand what we are looking at. But nonetheless, if we emphasize synthesis and characterization, then we simply do material discovery faster.
Great, thank you. So another question from the audience is, can your method to be applied to biological microorganisms?
Microorganisms are probably a little bit more too complicated because they are kind of multi-level structures, and if we just bring them apart, we will not necessarily be able to synthesize the knowledge about the parts into the knowledge about the whole. But for biomolecules, this is actually one of the successful examples of this approach because cryo-electron microscopy and electron diffraction are actually successful for biomolecules. And slightly more than 10 years ago, cryo-electron microscopy of biomolecules was called a blobology, which, as you can imagine, not a very endearing term. So now it is the main part of the drug discovery pipeline for companies such as Eli Lilly and so on and so forth. So once the method have a downstream applications, the number of the investments start to grow.
Another question is, so combinatorial material libraries are useful to reveal unexpected phenomena. How can AI be designed to not only to optimize non-objectives, but also recognize genuinely novel or surprisingly discoveries that fall outside existing physical models?
So that's actually an excellent question. So you see, there are levels of novelty. So if the novelty is in the properties that we measure, we can build acquisition functions for the Bayesian optimization that will try to discover the novelty in the property space. So this is well-formulated problem. If the novelty is in the sense of the new physics, then we need to somehow dynamically construct the models based on the experimental data. And then in the most general space, we kind of structure our experiment in such a way that we try to take the next measurement in the part of the parameter space where the disagreement between the theory and experiment is expected to be largest. So the limitation here is twofold. So limitation number one is that experiment can sample only very low dimensional parameter space, whereas most theories can operate with basically all chemical space. So essentially, if we have the very high dimensional chemical space of any system, then the manifolds, one or two dimensional manifolds, can be sampled fast, and everything else can be sampled slowly. And second thing that is very important in this case is to define how we balance the belief into theory and the experiment. So if the theory and the experiment disagree, that may mean that the theory is incorrect or the experiment is incorrect. And we don't have any way to balance those unless we have some higher level knowledge. So this balance of beliefs is absolutely normal. For example, I can use the sample to calibrate the microscope. Then I believe in the sample, but I don't know what happens with the microscope. Or I can use the microscope to characterize the sample. Then I believe in instrument, but the sample is unknown. Same thing applies everywhere else, and that's just a judgment we need to make based on the factors external to the theory experiment pair.
Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I think we have to conclude it here. Again, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Kalinin.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So our final speaker for today is Dr. Taylor Sparks from University of Utah. Dr. Taylor Sparks is a professor of material science and engineering at the University of Utah and one of the leading voices in the rapidly growing field of materials informatics. Dr. Sparks earned his PhD in applied physics from Harvard University in 2012, where his research focused on computational approaches to material science. Since joining the University of Utah, he has become internationally recognized for integrating machine learning, artificial intelligence, data science, and sustainable engineering to accelerate the discovery and optimization of advanced materials. His research demonstrates how data-driven methods can dramatically reduce the time required to identify materials with targeted properties for applications ranging from energy technologies to advanced manufacturing. In addition to his research accomplishments, Dr. Sparks is widely admired for his educational outreach through online courses, tutorials, and open educational resources that have helped thousands of researchers learn material informatics. He co-hosts a very popular materialism podcast with over 50,000 subscribers on YouTube. Welcome, Dr. Sparks, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. That's a really kind introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides. I'm excited to talk to this group today. I feel a bit like I'm an imposter, right? I'm not really a carbon material person, so I hope that this will still be useful. I've tried to structure it in a way that's sort of domain agnostic, including carbon materials. What I'm going to describe today is what I'm referring to as the LLM revolution in material science, right? And that's a bit of a hyperbole word, right? Sort of, but I think that it might live up to the hype in this case. Since we had our ChatGPT moment in 2021, right? November of 2021, 5 years on almost, it's pretty, no one's arguing, I think, that LLMs have not been revolutionary. So the big question is, what are they doing for our field? I'm going to show you two really cool examples of what I think they're doing for our field. First off, I come from the University of Utah, located in beautiful Salt Lake City. Our lab is in the lower right-hand corner of this picture, which is rad because you can be 30 minutes from skiing at great resorts or even faster if you don't mind going to the backcountry. The work that you're going to see presented today comes from two exceptional students, and I want to make sure they get the credit. On the left is Trupti Mohanty. She's now a postdoc at Argonne National Lab doing agentic workflows. And on the right is Hassan Saeed, a postdoc at the NETL, doing work on a variety of things, including RAG and LLM architectures. So they're the ones who deserve the credit. I just got to tell you about the cool work that they did, but they're the ones who did it, and I want to make sure that's clear. So when I say that it's accomplishing big things, we're aiming really high. I would go so far to say is that we're making meaningful progress towards solving some of the grand challenges that have been out there in material science. The first is limited data. I've been doing this for 15 years, this whole materials plus data, concept. And for the longest time, everybody you talk to would say, yeah, but there's not enough data for material science. Yeah, we might generate it, but it's not available. I think that we have a way to potentially solve that problem and that we have essentially started to solve it. And the second one is inverse design. Like this is probably the one that got me hooked in this major 25 years ago when I sat down in a class here at the University of Utah and they told me, hey, there's a bunch of materials that could exist. And if we knew what we cared about in terms of, say, properties for some application, we could make that material that has those properties that doesn't yet exist. That was cool. That hooked me. So that's inverse design. And I'm going to show you some tools that we've built that start to go towards inverse design. Okay, so I see a hand. Do you want to take questions as we go? I'm happy to. Maybe not. Okay, well, I'm happy to take questions as we go. If we get through my slides or not, I don't really care. I'm happy to have a discussion.
Not yet, I guess. Maybe at the end. I mean, I don't see any hands up there.
Okay. Let's start with this materials data problem. It's ironic that we say that we don't have enough materials data because there's a colossal amount of data being generated. Take a look at this plot. This is the number of publications on a log scale on the y-axis, and the x-axis is linear. So that's exponential growth, right? I should update this for 2026. I did it for 2024, I think, recently. But you basically have exponential growth, something like 10,000 papers per year in all of these areas. And, I should have looked up carbon materials ahead of time, but they would be similar, I'm sure. So it's not that we don't have enough research happening generating useful data. It's that data is not showing up in a format that we can easily use it. And people have tried to solve this problem for a while. Actually, not that long. It only goes back to like 2010. The earliest papers for extracting data out of the literature and building databases with them does not go back very far. Check it out. These papers from 2010 era are things like Chemical Tagger, Chem Data Extractor, Oscar 4. They were well-intentioned, but not very effective. There's a reason why this field didn't take off. The sort of best of tools at the time just didn't do a good job of getting data out of papers. The problem is that humans write in such different ways. There's so much nuance in vocabulary and writing styles that there wasn't a simple tool. And these were all based off of semantic rules. Like basically you had to know the grammar of the sentences and very strict programmed rules for extracting things using named entity recognition. Didn't work very well. So then we fast forward a little bit to the late 2010s, 2015, 16, 17 era. And now you see the emergence of NLP, natural language processing. This is like lowercase LLM, right? Before the big LLM happened in 2021, that's kind of what this stuff was. And it was better. In fact, that paper on the right here, the one in chemistry materials, I probably had 15 people send me this paper saying, check it out. Do you think they've solved the materials data extraction problem? And I was even in the room when Elsa presented this at the TMS meeting in 2017 or whatever it was. And I remember thinking like, God bless them for trying. This is a really cool approach. I just don't think it's going to be good enough. And so in my mind, at least, I filed this problem away as grand challenge. I don't know when or how we're going to solve this. It just seems too hard for anything that we have available. But if you take a look, it's probably small on your screen, but if you look at the bottom, this paper was submitted August 2017. What else happened? In summer of 2017, people who are AI enthusiasts may know that is when the transformer architecture was born. That was when attention is all you need. Google's landmark paper showed up. And obviously they didn't have time to implement it in this paper since they had just finished their study, but that changed everything. The very next year, we see the emergence of transformer-based language model architectures that were doing cool things. There's Cybert, ChemBert, MatScibert. These are basically language models that are trained on specific corpuses of data, including material science. And they do better. They interpret language in the way that we as material scientists write about things in our papers. So these should do a better job of extracting that data. And then the paper that changed my mind, the one that made me say, dang, this is going to work, showed up in December as a preprint in December 2022. I was on my sabbatical in England at the time. And I saw this figure and I sort of went through the paper, and sure enough, they took unstructured data, just the abstract in this first paper, abstract only. And if they did a whole bunch of manual annotation, like 100 examples, which is a pain in the butt to do, and then 500 examples of sort of human supervised extraction, so a partially tuned model. Now they came up with their fine-tuned LLM, and sure enough, it could take unstructured data and it could structure it. There's a lot of problems with the way that it did it. For one thing, the token size limitation meant that they were only looking at the abstract. Another one is that there's a bunch of data in figures, and this did not touch figures. There's hand labeling. There's other problems, like the format that it spat out would change every time. Like it wouldn't always use the keyword formula or structure or application, right? It would be sort of random every time. So that's not good if you want to build a database. But this was the proof of concept, to me at least, that said, dang, this is now a solvable problem. Now we need to grind the gears and make it happen. I'm going to show you what we've done to do that. First thing we did was a preliminary study. I wanted to know, data's out there. What does it look like? Where and how? Like, sure, I've been an academic for a long time. I've been many years in reading academic articles, but let's be systematic and explore this. So a team from our university decided to dive into that. And basically we want to know, like, we know that data's out there in text, tables, and figures, but what type of information? Well, there's named entities, there's processing conditions, there's characterization descriptions, and then there's the properties. And often, material scientists that want to do machine learning only care about the named entity and the property. But the other stuff matters too. And all of these things are found in the text, but not in their entirety. Tables, on the other hand, typically don't have the properties the processing conditions, they do a pretty good job of partially structuring that. And that, after all, that's what we're after, is structured data. This is partially structured. You've got named entities and properties, sometimes with characterization interspersed is a little bit more common. And then the figures, these are the real gold mines. This is where a ton of data lives, but maybe not every single data point matters here. Like take like a spectra from a spectroscopy or something. Probably what you want is like the peak location as opposed to every single data point. So there's a lot of superfluous data, I'm going to say here. Maybe it's not totally superfluous, but there's definitely higher value data and like lower. There's hierarchical information basically encoded in figures. And there's a lot of information in the figures, which is not going to be captured by our language models. In fact, this was sort of our view. We looked at, again, this was an admittedly small sample size. We looked at like 10 papers or something, but this is, I think, pretty representative. You find broad amounts of data in the text covering all the different types. You find a lot more data in tables, but you miss some types, and then even more data in the figures, but you're losing out on context with a lot of time with the figures. In fact, I remember thinking like, boy, that's a bummer. That's like 70% of your data is tied up in the figures and our language models won't be able to get it. And I was telling people that a couple of years ago at a meeting, at a workshop at UC Santa Barbara. And somebody told me, hey, you know, these language models are no longer language models. They're multimodal. And I was like, well, yeah, like they can't interpret graphs. He's like, I think they can actually get data from graphs. I did not think that was possible at the time. I had seen people working on computer vision for 10 years and I hadn't seen anything convincing, but check it out. Take a look at this graph on the left. Just like I think it's an XPS curve that I took from the data. I just dropped that into the multimodal, you know, flagship models that were available at the time. This was 2 years ago, I think we did this work. So at the time, one was from Perplexity, one was from ChatGPT. I don't remember the exact models. You can refer to our paper, but like at the time, they were the best that you could get in these sort of commercial multimodal models. And what do you see? Well, the darkest blue, that would be my manual annotation. Like I used WebPlot Digitizer, a tool for grabbing data points. It's very faithful recreation of the data. But the lighter blue and the teal color both come from those language models. And they do way better than I expected, right? They're certainly getting the general trend, and they're even in ballpark in the right values of X and Y. Like there is a shift in the X, and the XPS experts in the room will tell me that being off by 2 electron volts is a big deal. That's not something that you can just ignore. But this told me that, holy cow, computer vision's gotten so good that we are going to solve this problem in the very near future. Even though it's not quite there yet, it's getting pretty close. Now, of course, that was a sort of easy problem, like a single line like that is the easiest scenario to sort of capture. How about this one where there's 3 data points and it's not lines, they're discrete values? Well, again, ChatGPT, Perplexity, we've tried the sense with other ones. The same trend occurs. Like you can get the correct trend of the data. You can get the rough correct values, but there are inconsistencies both in the number of points captured and the actual XY positions are not exactly right either. And some stuff that I thought I would do great at, it totally bombed at. Like, take a look at this one. To me, it's clear that there's 20 or so data points and there's a guide to the eye, but our language models thought that the guide to the eye was more data points. It did not capture that. Or take a look at this one where it surprised me how well it did. Interpreting semantic meaning from something like the basic concepts as opposed to the individual values does a great job. They do a really good job at this. I'd argue better than most humans do. So this was slick. We published this. This is now published in the journal Integrating Materials and Manufacturing, where I serve as editor, but have no fear. I did not edit my own submission. Special thanks to the guest editors that helped us manage this one. I think that basically my takeaway from it, if you just want like a one-sentence takeaway, it's that computer vision is going to solve the data in figures part of this problem very, very soon. In the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see it happening. We're already see it happening, which is exciting. Okay, so let's go back to our task in getting data out of the literature. I did not want to do 600 examples of manually labeling data. That is not fun for anybody. So can we do better? At the time, we were exploring structured prompts. If you've heard of like few-shot learning versus zero-shot learning, that's kind of what this is. The concept, if you're not familiar with it, zero-shot learning says you ask the language model to do some task, like get the data, the materials data out of this paper and structure it for me. But you don't tell it how, and you don't give it any examples. In a structured prompt or few-shot learning, you're giving it examples. So you still give the task, like you're a lean, mean data extracting machine, go out there and get that data for me. And then you say, by the way, here's some examples. Had this been in the input, this is the output I'd want. And you give it a couple examples. We found that with as few as 5 examples, very easy to generate 5 labeled examples, not 500. It really improved the performance. Take, for example, here's this block of text on the left from, I don't know, some paper. It's able to very accurately sort of do the extraction, which is exciting. So we tested it out. One of the things we did is we tested it on a bunch of different papers, and then we ran each prompt with 5 examples only, but we repeated the extraction 5 times because there is this stochastic nature to language models where you tell it to write the same thing 5 times and it will actually give you 5 different versions. And then we compared the outputs of those 5 different versions with something that we did in fact hand label to see our performance. Okay, what you're seeing here is the metrics that are commonly used for data extraction. You've got your Rouge scores and your BERT score. The Rouge score basically says, did it get the exact value that the hand labeled example would have had? It doesn't care about word order. It just says, is the value there? And is another value there that shouldn't have been there? So it's just a hardcore like precision and recall value. BERT score is more nuanced. The BERT score comes from a transformer where things like the phrase, it is cold today and it's freezing outside are totally different words. So Rouge would score those differently, but they have the same meaning, don't they? BERT scores after meaning. It uses embeddings to capture general semantic meaning. So using BERT score would look really good, but Rouge scores is not good. And for the longest time, I sort of wondered, like, is that a good or a bad thing? Like, is this good enough? And I've come to the decision that I don't think this is good enough. I don't want like a synonym when I'm talking about data extraction. If the value is 0.5, I want 0.5. I don't want 0.47 and think that it's good. You want the actual value. So it's not really good enough here. We got to do better. So it's a promising first start. We've got to do better. Structured prompt certainly is helpful in reducing the amount of data needed, but it's not helping us with other problems. For one thing, the models will still hallucinate. They will tell you that they extracted a data point, which is just not even accurate. It is incorrect. Another thing is there is no mechanism for validation or correction in this process. That's a huge bummer. And then lastly, and maybe most critically, there was no schema compliance. So you want your data organized in some specific way, but it would randomly like label categories different every time. So if I was trying to build a database afterwards, I have all this apples and oranges weirdness. I have to like line it up. That's not gonna work. So good news is we have tools that can fix this, right? In the year 2025, it was called the year of the agent. Year 2026, we're calling it the year of the personal assistant, which is using agents to do all these tasks for us. You guys all know how this works now. This, I think, instead of just having the language model try and one shot, right, whatever you asked it to do, you now give it this chain of thought concept where it can think about its action, it can propose an action, it can actually observe the results of that action, it can go back and ask itself, did I do what the human wanted me to do? And if not, maybe I repeat that action. That agentic sort of chain of thought process is exactly what we need with data extraction. So another thing that it can do is because it can think about its action, it can do what's called tool calling. Tool calling has become crucial in agentic workflows. You remember the early days of ChatGPT, if you'd ask it how many R's are in the letter strawberry or in the word strawberry, and it would say all sorts of crazy things. Well, now, because it knows that some things are harder than it can do using its pre-trained language model ability, it can instead write the text for a script, like a little Python script, to go and manually actually count those things. Like, so tasks where the language model doesn't do well, it can do tool calling to do well at those things. And one good example of that is schema enforcing. We can use a tool like Pydantic, right? Where it forces the output of the language model to be in a very specific ontology that you can define ahead of time, your schema or your ontology, you can define it. So for us, we want like a list of compositions, and for each composition, I want it to have processing conditions, characterization, the property names, and I want that to be broken into like the name of the character property, the value, and its unit. Like you can define exactly how you want, and it will force the output of the language model to match that. Fantastic. No more hallucinated structures. Okay, and then we can actually do the extraction. Here's our overall workflow for what we're calling NOMAT, right? This is a multi-agent workflow. We're going to have an agent that actually parses the paper to turn the PDF into something that the language models can interact with. We have the extraction agent who's actually going to get the data out of that unstructured text. We have an evaluator agent who's going to basically check the work of the extractor and decide, do you have to go back and do this again? And we'll give it the option of actually rerunning it a couple times. You have a manager agent who takes everything that's been up until that point and figures out, what do I do with this? Like if you did 3 extractions, which ones do you keep? Which ones do you toss? Which do you merge some from multiple extractions? And then you have your flagging agent, which tells you as the human, what should you think about this data? Is it good? Is it done? Is it good? Bad? And then we actually dump it into a database. So this works great. We are using Dockling. Over the years, we've used different ones. The current one that we like for parsing is Dockling. It does a good job of separating text from tables and images. We actually take those tables and we pass them through a multimodal model GPT-5 to get markdown language from them. You don't have to. That's just what we choose to do. Again, we use schema constraining via Pydantic. It does a great job of forcing it into a single JSON format that we want everything to come out at. The evaluation agent does a great job. We extract it, and then the evaluator basically says it compares the input text, like maybe the text said thermal conductivity of alumina is 32.5 watts per meter Kelvin at 300K. And then it looks at the extracted data in the JSON and it compares them, right? And it says, oh, I think I see a problem. There's a type of problem. The type is a hallucination. You pulled 32, but it should have been 32.5. And then it says, I found another problem. There's a missing measurement condition. The paper said 300 Kelvin, but you didn't include one. And so it gives it a low confidence and triggers a next extraction. We're going to extract it again. But critically, instead of just saying do it again, it sends it the message to do it again with a specific prompt. It says, here's the things you got wrong. Do it right this time. And odds are that these mistakes that it made will get corrected when you tell it what it got wrong. Makes sense, right? Tell it what it did wrong. It's more likely to do it better. So sure enough, the second time, it will then do another evaluation of the extraction. And maybe it got something wrong that second time, no problem. It's still going to point to it. And now the manager agent says, given these multiple extractions, here's what I think the final result should be, right? That's what ends up getting passed to the database. But before it does so, we send it to the flagging agent where it basically gives a confidence for the extraction. You could come up with lots of ways to do this. My student actually gave it a rubric. He actually hard-coded it. He said, when giving it assigning a score between 0 and 1, like 0 and 100% basically, here's the things that you should pay attention to. Did it ever have to do another extraction? Was it a hallucination or a missing condition? Like what types of errors did we see? Did it have to do multiple extractions? How far off? You could say, was it 1% off or 10% off in the numerical value? Was it 100% off, right? You could use those to build in a rubric that then tells the human, hey, maybe a human better look at this. I don't think the language model did a good enough job of doing this extraction. And then it gets dumped to a database, which we're pretty excited about. So this is very effective. It is way, way better than what we've been doing in the past. Take a look here. Like here you're seeing the precision and the recall, and then the combined F1 score, which takes precision and recall. And we're comparing this baseline where there's no agentic approach and our NOMAT, which has this agentic approach. And basically you go from 50-ish percentile, which is what we saw before, to over 90 percentile. And it's in a format which is every output matches one another. So you can actually start building databases. Is 90% good enough is maybe the next question that we got to think about as a community, and at what cost? Because I'll tell you right now, when we did this paper, we used the flagship models, the best that we could get at the time, which meant at the time that per paper extraction, it was something like 70 cents to $1 per extraction. You can absolutely do it for cheaper if you use, open source model. My gosh, every day I open my laptop and there's like a new amazing model that's been released by somebody. Gemma 4 just came out a month ago and people are psyched about Gemma 4, the latest low cost Gemini model. And next week there'll be something else that's amazing. So the cost is going to continue to go down for sure. And so I think what we need to decide as a community is, how good is good enough when it comes to these? This is a question that's always comes to my mind with machine learning. How good is good enough, right? In my mind, 90% plus on accuracy of data, I can build a model on that. Like even if I have by the way, even if a human do the data extraction, getting 90% plus, good luck, right? I've done it. I've paid undergrads in pizza to get data for me, and 90% is tough to get. And $1 per paper, I guess it depends on how many papers we're talking about extracting. Going back to what I started to talk earlier today, we said there's 10,000 papers per year. Okay, like if we as a community decided to get all the data from every carbon paper, let's say there's 100,000 a year, would we pay $100,000 to have the data updated each year? I don't know. But I think that your average academic, because I've worked on materials informatics problems for a long time, they don't typically have 100,000 papers. They'll show me a PDF of repository in Zenodo or something, or Mendeley, and it might have 1,000 PDFs. So now you're going to extract that data set from that for on the order of $1,000. I mean, I spend more on crucibles in a month than that. Like that is not an out of bounds sort of pricing to get materials of data that would make you AI ready. So I'm going to personally consider this not a solved problem, but we are well on our way to having the materials data problem solved. It is an exciting time to be doing materials informatics because we've got data that we just didn't have before. It's pretty psyched about this. Again, this is published now in IMMI, also published this in my journal. Very happy for you guys to try this out and very thankful for the guest editor. I think this one might have been, I'm forgetting who did this one, if it was Jim Warren at NIST or who, but special thanks to the guest editor who helped edit this one. Okay, we've talked about limited data with NOMAT. Now let's pivot and talk about CRISText, our way of solving inverse design. Take a look at my clock. Yeah, we're doing good. All right, so generative models are in the news. They are very exciting. You see things like here's MatterGen. This is Microsoft's model for doing property-guided materials design. So they want to come up with entirely new crystal structures that no one's seen before that have a specific property ahead of time. Is that even possible? So Microsoft and Google and others have sort of sucked all the air out of the room, but academics like us have been working on this since COVID or so, and it's been exciting, the progress that's been made. What has been missing, though, is true inverse design. If you talk to chemists or material scientists, they'll tell you for some application, oh, if you want a durable solar cell material, like here's the design rules that you should be looking for, including information about, say, the crystal structure. So what's been missing in these generative models is the ability to take those text-based design rules and use those to actually condition the output of the generative model. And that is what we're starting to see solved with the latest work in this area using language models. Now, using language models was a surprise. Here's a review article from Aaron Walsh's brilliant group at Imperial College just 2 years ago in 2024. What do you see? On the left, there's a bunch of different models they're exploring. And in the middle column, where it has the generation architecture, it's GANs, it's VAEs, it's diffusion, it's all the normal stuff that we've been using, say, for images, right? We're really good at taking text and turning it into images in all sorts of different ways. Well, they had done the same thing. And some of them used coordinates, some of them used voxels, some of them used whatever. But the paper I want to point to here that surprised everyone is the one in the middle called Crystal LLM, where it used an autoregressive transformer. I was on my sabbatical in England at the time. I went down to the University of Reading and met with Ricardo Grau Crespo, one of the authors of this paper, and Keith Butler, actually, at Imperial College. I saw him too and was talking to them, and they told me they were going to do this. They said, hey, we know that everyone's using diffusion and variational autoencoders and GANs, but we're going to use the language model to do it. And I remember thinking like, oh, it's a terrible idea, guys. Like, I get the concept. Like in the middle of the screen, you can see like there's this, if you've seen a Civ card, it looks something like this. You describe the crystal structure and it shows like the ABC of the unit cell, the alpha, beta, gamma, and eventually the basis of the atoms there. And so what they were going to do is not even a language model. This was just a transformer, autoregressive transformer, because all they did was they provided the first line of this, like potassium bromide, data equals K1 BR1, and then you let the autoregressive transformer finish it. I did not think this would work because we had done something kind of similar with our GANs where we did not give it a chance to learn bond distances. Like if all you give it is the atom and the bases, that means that if it gets the symmetry number wrong of the space group, basically, it's going to get everything else wrong. And you never gave it a chance to learn tools to pick the right space group, essentially. So I did not think this was work, and I told them not to do it. And I was so wrong. I was so wrong. I'm so glad they didn't listen to me, because it did great. Speaking of carbon data sets, right? In these different sort of benchmark data sets of having it generate structures, it was competitive, in some cases actually outperforming some of the really much more mature variational autoencoders or diffusion-based approaches like diffCSP or CDVAE that were, had like a 5-year head start on them. Like were much, much more robust tools. And it was sort of competitive, blew everybody away. And if they did that without even a fully, fine-tuned language model, what if you actually threw a proper language model at this? So Meta, of all people, Meta, right? Facebook company jumps in and they jump on this. And we see this paper where now they introduce inverse design. To my knowledge, this is the first time where they actually did inverse design using language models and crystal structure design. Because they took the bunch of crystal structures that were in some database. I think they used the materials project. And this time they took the information about the crystal structure, like the unit cell, the space group, the bases. They pulled all that out of the Civ card, which is kind of odd since language models are good at understanding data in the context of other textual data, but regardless, they pulled it out. And then when they had it generate new materials, they could actually provide a text prompt. They said like, hey, generate a material that has the formula that is this, or has the space group that is this, or has energy with the whole is this. Now, it didn't work particularly well. If you look at the times, the fraction of times that their conditions were met, It was not great. Even just getting formula, about half the time they were not getting it right. Trying to get the space group, you're clear down at 24%. If you're trying to get energy above the whole, about half the time. So the condition matching, the ability to do this inverse design was limited. But it provided a starting point for now a bunch of other teams, including my own, to jump into this and try and make it better. Something to be aware of is that you have to do something called fine tuning. Like the language model does not know how to generate these CIV cards without seeing examples. And in an infinite compute world, you would do a full-on fine-tuning. Like, so for example, this model that they used was a 70 billion parameter model. They used Llama 2 70 billion. So 70 billion is a big model. It's a very big model. And if in a perfect world, what you would do is you would train every single one of those 70 billion parameters of weights. That is expensive. So nobody does that. Instead, we do these things like Q-LoRa fine-tuning, which is sort of a cheater way to fine-tune the model, where instead of training all the 70 billion parameters, you train two matrices, which when they're multiplied together, give you the same size as the weights of the model. And so you're training fewer of those weights and then you're concatenating them together. And in principle, you can get away with way, way less memory without really getting dramatically worse performance. So this has become pretty popular. So that's what we did. I'm going to show you a video here in just a second that describes this process. But basically, we are able to provide a prompt. We're going to say, hey, here's the prompt. You have to follow the instruction, which is always, generate a CIV card. But given a specific condition, like the material composition needs to be this, or it needs to be in this space group, or in this case, the energy above the hole needs to be 0 so that it's a stable material. So this is a new way for us to condition our generative models to do a specific task. Now you could do this with diffusion, like there is text-based guiding in the latent space with diffusion or VAEs or GANs. It's just easy and native with language models. So let's take a look at it in action. My student built this using a 4-bit quantized LLM. So basically that's the fine tuning that we did with Q-LoRa. We started with a couple different open source models. I'll show you the comparisons. We took data from the materials project, somewhere around 20 to 30,000 different structures to train on. And then you see it in action. Here she is asking it to make a new material, neodymium, silver, mercury 2 in the space group 225. And boom, off to the races. You see it make the unit cell, make the angles, come up with the symmetry arguments. And then eventually right here at the bottom, you see it actually populating the basis, right? The atoms, the minimum number of atoms to describe this, and then symmetry does the rest. And it doesn't take very long. You could make hundreds of thousands of these things in a week, right? Very easy to generate structures. Question is, are they good? So you take this output structure and we need to compare it. How do we know if it's good? The best tool, the one that everyone seems to use, is Structure Matcher, which thank God for PyMatGen. It's a great resource for us in this community. One of the reasons why I like it is that obviously there's a convention in how a human would draw this picture structure, these unit cell, like where you would put the atoms, like what do you call the 000 point is arbitrary selection. And if you choose it differently, it's still the same structure, but you have to way of matching it. One of the cool things about Structure Matcher is it does transformations to match things. So even if you pick kind of a goofy way to define your 000 position in the unit cell, it'll still match it correctly, which is great. It'll also let you match it based off of arbitrary. You decide how much difference you're going to allow in the lattice, in the actual site positions, and the angles. You can decide either as exact values or percent differences, which is nice. So what do we see? Well, here I'm showing you two different models. We tried it with two different open source models, one from Meta, that's the Llama model, and one from Mistral. We've since done it with Qwen as well. And they're pretty good. Like composition matching, we can get this over 90%, like very, very accurate. Space group matching over 70% of the time, and composition and space groups similar. So I remember when my grad student first came to me, we were like drawing on my whiteboard over here, and she's like, oh, it's only 70% accurate. I was like, pump the brakes, girl. Like, this is amazing. That's amazing. You just asked a language model trained off of internet nonsense and with a very modest amount of fine tuning using like we did not get crazy compute for this. I bought one H100 GPU. So it's like a $35,000 cluster that we bought for my group. And that was plenty to do this. And it's basically able for some crazy new compound, it's able to get the exact structure right 70% of the time is on its first guess. That's completely nuts to me. And if you give it obviously more guesses, like up to 20 guesses, then your accuracy will only continue to climb, sort of asymptoting. Now it does depend on, like all machine learning processes, there is this idea of class imbalance. Like if you have more data of a certain type, it will do better. So for space group 225, for whatever reason, our databases and therefore nature and human interest skews towards that compound. We have a lot of them. And so the errors are really small. It knows how to guess them. They also tend to be simpler structures. If you go to other ones that are lower symmetry, there's fewer examples and the errors are a little bit higher. But in all cases, the errors are, to me, shockingly low. Like it is very, very good at this task when it does a valid structure. Some structures are valid, but they're not matching. Like take a look at that top row. That was from my PhD days. I worked on oxide thermoelectrics. That is sodium cobaltate, very famous oxide thermoelectric, but it switched the sodium and the cobalt positions. That's not going to work, right? So it's a valid structure, but it is not a matching structure. It's not the correct structure. Sometimes it would do the same thing, but it would swap the space group or whatever else. So these are all valid structures, but they're not a match. Sometimes it would give you structures that are not valid at all. Like if you look at this one and the actual is on the left, the generated is on the right, it looks really close. The values are all pretty correct, pretty close in terms of lattice parameters and stuff. But then take a look at the basis on that I4 position. Instead of giving a value between 0 and 1 on where that iodine is located, it drops a website, right? So here it hallucinated, which is not good, right? So it is a language model. It still can do that. So this, when you try and process this, it'll call an error. It'll say, hey, there's something wrong with this sieve card. Sometimes the invalid structures are more nuanced. Like take a look at this one. The lithium 3 and the silver 5 both fully occupy the 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 position. That doesn't work. They can share that site, but they can't both fully occupy it, right? Or this one where it says that it made the correct composition, but when you do the math based off of the Wyckoff numbers, it's not correct. It's actually one of those is off, so it's invalid. Generally, this conditioning, though, is pretty great. One of the cool things that we've been talking a lot about as a group is how do you get out of, and this was from a lot of criticisms that we were getting as a community, including some high-profile papers from, Ram Seshadri, Tony Cheatham, Simon. There's a lot of people that are sort of pointing out very valid criticisms. One of the things that they're saying is like all these models are turning out slight variations of stuff that we've already seen before. They're not really new. They're just slight variations. I don't disagree with them. The bigger question is how do we train our models to actually seek out something new? Well, if you remember in the early days of ChatGPT, you might remember that there was this temperature parameter that you could actually, in the early days, you could adjust that in the GUI. Nowadays, you can't, it's no longer visible in the GUI. Instead, you can adjust it in the API. When you call these models via API, you can actually send the temperature parameter. And basically, the higher temperature gives the model freedom to be more creative. Lower temperature makes it way more deterministic, like stick to the exact phrasing that you've seen before. With the concept, like if you're emailing your boss, turn that temperature down. But if you're brainstorming ideas, turn the temperature up a little bit. By the way, the mechanism why this do this is pretty slick. They actually do a transformation on the token probabilities. And it does a transformation that basically flattens the distribution so that we all know that like the next most probable word is this, but when you do the transformation, it flattens it so that another word, which is less probable, has a higher chance of being selected, which is pretty slick. And so what we expect to see is that when you turn the temperature up, which in this plot is going from dark green to light green, dark purple to light purple, that the fraction of structures that are valid should probably suffer, right? If you're basically saying be more crazy creative, then you're going to get slightly lower performance. Now on this plot, the y-axis only goes from 90 to 100. So you don't actually lose a ton. Like these are still pretty good, but it does get slightly worse. And that's by assessment using things like the SMACT library or structural validity distances based off of sort of known distances that you might expect to see in compounds. But what you should see on the other hand is that as you turn up temperature, that it should give you more creative responses. Here's another example of how when you use these things, the generated structures shown in green are able to match pretty closely the trained on structures, whether you're looking at the lattice parameters or the angles or the space groups. We do a pretty good job of memorizing the distribution of data that has seen in 20,000 examples. It learns how to reproduce that pretty faithfully. But what's cool is that now we can actually force it to do new things. Here's this classic example, like girl with the pearl on the left, and then you've got all these different variations. My favorite is the Erling Haaland one from the World Cup this week, right? But the question I would ask you guys is, of these 4 generated variations of it, which is the most similar to the original? And which one's the most unique from the original? And the problem is that, like, how many people are on the call? Like 50 or something people on this call? You'd get 50 different answers. So what we need is a tool that everyone can agree on. And so we've actually built a couple of those tools, a couple of distance metrics. that measure uniqueness and novelty. I think I've got them. I didn't include the links to them. I'm happy to share them afterwards. But now we've built tools that measure uniqueness of compound generated based off of chemistry, structure, and the combination of those two. And when we use those metrics now here, you can see that as you turn the temperature up, going to the light purple, going to the light green, yeah, the valid structures go down a little bit, but your uniqueness goes up. So this is a cool new way for us to explore this Pareto front of give me unique structures and give me valid structures, so you can try and get the best of both worlds. Ultimately, the proof is in the pudding. You want to actually make these things. The first step would be to do DFT and relax them and see how much they move. Like, is this its most stable structure? Or if you allowed the atoms to move a little bit, would they move? Would they go to a totally different structure? We're not real DFT experts in my group. We dabble. But when we talk to the DFT experts, they all say, yeah, these look pretty good. They seem to be in their most stable structure. Like here above is showing you the as generated and then the relaxed structures and how much they actually move. And it's very, very, very little. How do we do better? In the time that I've got left, I've got about 5 minutes. We can do better. Like, it still does some invalid things, dropping websites in, putting in crazy distances, not matching structures. How do we do better? Reinforcement learning. You just heard Sergei as your previous speaker. He's one of the OGs in this field, like absolute remarkable work he's been doing in reinforcement learning for materials informatics. We took a page from his book. Reinforcement learning is a very flexible architecture to come up with a way to bias your model to do what you want based off of what you desire. It's very customizable, very flexible. Here's how we did it. The tool that we used is called GRPO. We did not come up with this. Computer scientists did. It stands for Group Relative Policy Optimization, and group relative is the key part of this. Instead of generating a single compound at a time, which Chris-Text is able to do, what if you let Chris-Text generate a batch of compounds, right? A group of compounds, so 10 or 20, I can't remember what our batch size was, but you let it generate a bunch of them. And what we're going to do is in that group, we're going to rank the ones highest to lowest based off of some rewards that we get to come up with as material scientists. Like, if it doesn't pass the check sieve, give it a big penalty, like negative reward. If it does match, give it a positive one. If it matches really tightly, give it an even bigger one. If it does other things that you might care about, like it has unpaired magnetic moments, because maybe you want magnetic materials, boom, make that a reward. Or it has, whatever, characteristics that you might care about, whether you're making batteries or capacitors or whatever, you can build those custom things into your reward. In fact, those could even be DFT calculations or MD calculations, particularly as we get faster with those using things like MLIPs. Those custom calculations can become part of your reward function. And then what GRPO does is it takes those rewards, it turns those into advantages, and using a pretty straightforward retuning of the model, it is able to retrain the weights of your model such that it gives you more compounds like the ones that were ranked higher via your rewards and advantages, and fewer compounds that were ranked lower. What this did is it massively improved performance, right? Here's our exact sort of model rewards. We gave it a check sieve reward, or actually a negative if it didn't pass it. We gave it several different structure matching awards as it got more and more accurate to the structure, like it was within 0.5 angstroms or 0.1 angstroms or 0.01 angstroms. We gave it increasing reward. We built a gradient into the reward function itself. And then what this ultimately allowed us to do is, yes, it improved performance. Like you see that the Chris-Text with reinforcement learning, RL, shown in blue, does in fact outperform either of our other models. But critically, the percent of times where we got invalid structures dropped dramatically, from like 30% of the time down to like less than 5% of the time. You can check this out. This is also published in my journal on integrating materials and manufacturing innovation. Special thanks, Raimundo Ariabe, who served as our guest editor. And then I'll just say, like, obviously I've mentioned like 4 good papers that we've published, and they're all in MMI because I'm a believer. I'm a believer in journals that are led for and by the community. Like, I'm a member of TMS. This is a TMS journal. This is a professional society that puts it together. Yes, we partner with Springer Nature to be our publisher, but we run it. So I'd like to say that we're not just like trying to make a buck. We're trying to serve the community. It has a decent impact factor, and we publish all the things: data, tools, research reviews, and then critically, I've got a pretty popular YouTube channel, and papers that get published on journal, I offer everybody the chance for me to create a video for them, which goes out to my 50,000 subscribers. And it's just a cool new way to get the word out about your work. Like, I summarize your work. I do my best to work with you to make sure I represent it correctly. And then it gets exposed to a totally different audience, which is pretty rad. And then the last thing I'll say is we have in addition to my YouTube channel, we have the Materialism podcast where we have tons of really cool episodes on all things material science. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have about the ways that LMs are revolutionizing material science.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Audience, you can send your questions through the Q&A. There is one specific question. I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read it for everyone. So, greetings, I'm from Bangladesh. I'm following you since October 2025. I watch your YouTube videos. My background is nature-inspired materials and surface engineering. In one of my works, I have 5-6 data points. These are from repetition of some wet lab experiments. I want to surpass the Edisonian trial and error. I want to predict the maximum static contact angle. As I have scarcity of data, should I rely on SHAP and PyMatGen, and should MatMiner do the rest? Will it be a good approach?
Okay. With this specific example, I need to know a little more detail to answer it, but I'll give you my broad response is that if you've only got 4 or 5 data points, you need to do one of two things. You either need to recognize I'm just not ever going to have enough data, and therefore what I really need is not a tool that predicts the value that you care about, but rather that guides you to most quickly learn how to get to that value. That's called active learning. And there's great, tools for that. The most popular is Bayesian optimization, using acquisition functions like expected improvement. Basically with that, the premise behind that is it says 5 or 6 data points is not enough for me to know how to solve this problem yet. But if I have a lab budget and I have up to 100 experiments that I can go and do in the lab, how do I most efficiently get to the point where I have a material that has the contact angle that I care about? Why Bayesian optimization is great for that is because it's built with uncertainty in mind. And right now, with only 5 data points, you're going to have big uncertainties. Your model is not going to really know the truth, but it's going to efficiently explore your design space to tell you exactly where you should look in the fewest, ideally, steps possible such that you can learn it fast. That's one option. The active learning approach, which says, I don't got the data, so I'm just going to be efficient about getting new data. The second approach is transfer learning, and this may be more relevant to your thing. So you're interested in a very specific class of biomaterials, it sounds like, and their contact angle with interfaces. Okay, maybe there's not a lot of literature data out there. There might be more than you think, by the way, and maybe tools like Nomad could help you scrape it. But let's assume that there's not in the literature. Well, contact angle is measured for many, many other things. So what if you could build a model that trains off of where you do have the data, some ability to take, say, composition and predict contact angle of different, interfaces, and then you could try and transfer learn that over to your new application. That's a more promising avenue, I think. Now, still with only 5 data points, that's not going to be, I would not personally have any confidence in that approach to be done with only 5 data points. But if I was going to combine the ability to go get new data, right, which is going to augment your data size, and the ability to transfer learn from some existing capability of predicting this, where you steadily not only grow your ability to get new data, but you're going to be increasing your ability to have confidence in the predicting transfer, that starts to look like a pretty viable option. So bad news is that you're going to need more data, in my opinion. But good news is that there's pretty good tools to help you get there.
Right, thank you. Next question is, DFT provides valuable atomic scale information, but engineers often care about device and system level performance. How can AI bridge quantum, atomistic, mesoscale, and continuum models to enable true multi-scale universe design?
Oh, you are a very timely question. If you look at, the calls coming out of funding agencies, National Science Foundation, others, you are hitting on a very important and timely topic that they are also asking us to sort of solve. The phrasing for what you're describing is called heterogeneous data. Heterogeneous data basically says like your data or multimodal data, right? It's coming from different modalities. You've got your DFT data, you've got your finite element data, you've got your MD, whatever, and then you have like the actual system. What we care about is a ultimate system level performance in some cases. And so what we need are machine learning approaches that can bridge modalities and bridge different types of data. And I wish I had an answer for you that this was like solved, but it's not solved yet. This is an ongoing research problem. And so this is actually a good area to be publishing and coming up with ideas about how to address this. I've heard some clever ideas for it. There's people that use graph approaches and they embed different types of data as a function of scale, basically in the same way that you can embed nodes and then edges connecting nodes. Some people have treated it in a graphical way. Other people treat it in a transfer learning way, like, okay, MD suggests this and DFT suggests, like, could we actually transfer from one to the other and sort of have a translator between different modalities? There's different approaches that people have suggested, but I have not seen one that is satisfying to everybody just yet. But it's an interesting area. It's a great topic. I hope that you're successful and that you publish it in IMI when you figure it out.
So there's a follow-up question on that. Can transfer learning breach different scales of modeling? For example, transferring knowledge from DFT calculations to continuum models or from simulations to experimental data?
Yeah.
What are the biggest obstacles?
There's a number of papers where they've done that type of thing. We published one where we took DFT data for predicting band gap and experimental data for predicting band. It's sort of well known that DFT underpredicts band gap, and there's corrections you can do to sort of correct that empirically. We wanted to build a machine learning model that did that. The way that we actually did it was through ensemble learning. Ensemble learning is when you take a machine learning model and the inputs to that model are the outputs of other machine learning models, which is kind of clever, right? So basically we can say, take a machine learning model that trains off of DFT data, where the benefit for us was that there was like 100,000 data points, which is great. So you've got statistical strength. And then take your experimental data set. We only had a couple thousand experimental data sets of band gap. And you're going to benefit from the statistical strength of you can hit like a neural network for your DFT stuff. And you're going to use like the very simple SVMs or random forest for your experimental data. And then your overall model that hierarchically assembles it together can benefit from the strengths of each of these individual models. So that's just one example. But I think that there's been others that other similar types of approach that people have come up with for taking differential data and merging them together. It's to the point where now I think that people have confidence in that type of approach.
Thank you. Well, I have a question, maybe it's a two-pronged question. So there's been an amazing improvement or achievements in the data-led material discovery, and you demonstrate a lot of achievements. So based on that, in the next 5 years or maybe even 10 years, what are the bottlenecks to get it even further? Now, you already have a tool that can extract data, analyze data, right, and an inverse design and everything. So what's the bottleneck for the next step? And what will be left for the human scientists if everything or most of things will be done by AI? Well, and that's for to lead our young researchers mostly.
Yeah. Let's say. That second question is the one that keeps me up at night. I don't know. Like the answer, the correct answer is, well, humans should do what humans do uniquely better than AI. But I'm not totally clear what that is. And it's changing so fast all the time. Anthropic, right? Their CEO just this week said in 2-3 years, AI will be better than humans at all things. And so what humans will be doing is basically like, yeah, he basically said like service tasks. They'll be like hospitality, like they'll be doing, gosh, I don't know. And that's like not really a future I'm excited about. I don't have a good answer to that second question. I will say that where my best answer to it is that humans do a good job of knowing context of model use. And it has become even more important for you to know your domain really well so that you understand the context for using models that are getting increasingly better all the time. You really need to be an expert in your field to be the best person at using those models for your field. And then your first question was, remember what was your first question again?
So what's the bottleneck to go further with the computational or AI-based material discovery?
In my opinion, I'm just talking about generative AI because that's where I'm spending a lot of my time right now. The big bottlenecks have been data, and I think we have an answer to data. Like I talked about that today. Another one is that most materials, generative models for making new materials are making an individual crystal structure. But that's not the world that surrounds us, whether it's our phones or whatever else, the floor I'm standing on, the desk this is on, they're not single phase materials, they're composites. And so that field is called heterogeneous materials, generative models that cannot generate a single phase, but rather realistic composite structures. Maybe that's an alloy. We've got like your gamma phase, gamma prime phase for superalloy, or whether it's precipitates in aluminum. Like it's it's understanding that multiple phases exist and that they can only exist in ways that thermodynamics allows. Like I can't just arbitrarily say like, give me this phase because there's no way to make it like that. So constraining models to be like more than single phase, but generative, that they can make multiple phases and phases that obey thermodynamics, whether you're incorporating CalFat or some sort of phase diagram information, like that is the frontier. That is one frontier. Another one is defects, right? Defects and disorder. All the materials you're going to generate are all perfect, but any DFT person will tell you that, it's controlling and designing and calculating for these defects that often gives rise to the properties you care about. Right, but right now we have no good representation for like disordered materials altogether, like glasses. Simon at oh my gosh, what's his last name? At Santa Barbara, I just draw a blank on his name. Anyways, he was talking about using radial distribution functions as maybe a new representation altogether. Maybe that's the future. Maybe we won't be using sieve card information at all for the materials that actually matter. But those are like a couple really, in my opinion, sort of horizon level challenges that we have to figure out for this field to take to the next level.
Well, thank you very much for the insights. So is there any question from our audience? No. So I think that concludes this session or today's session. Dr. Sparks, thank you very much for your time and wonderful presentation. And thank you all the attendants and hope to see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have again wonderful talks from Boston University, I guess, right? Tomorrow, yes, University of Chicago Argonne Lab, and then Boston University, and then kind of a hands-on experience or hands-on demonstration with Morgan Wall from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So bring your computers or prepare your computers, the audience, if you want to follow that hands-on demo of the tools for materials discovery. Once again, thank you all for attending and hope to see you tomorrow. And thank you, Dr. Sparks.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.